I work at a retail store and I detest my job with all my heart. Because I was a dumb shit and said I was always available though, they'd routinely fuck me over and put me on nights. I whine and bitch and moan and digress. I'm okay working nights since I get to see my boyfriend when he picks me up at least. Boyfriend usually gets off at 10:30, but he doesn't leave until 11. Most nights I'd have to wait for him to arrive. On top of that, he had to make a 10-minute drive as well, so I'd have to wait around an hour and 40 to 45 minutes. That didn't really bother me that much though. He'd call to tell me he was coming and make sure I was still alive at least. Earlier in the week, an Uber driver had kept on asking me if I was someone named Lenore. I told him no, and he did it again, but this time kept asking if I was sure. How the fuck am I not gonna be sure of my name? Fortunately, at that moment, my boyfriend pulled in and honked at me, causing this Uber creep to speed away. I'm a paranoid penny, so this made me wonder if he'd been watching me or something, and knew my boyfriend always came late. Then I tweaked out, since I'd kept on getting these weird phone calls from a telemarketing agency or something. Whenever I'd answer though, no one was there, and they'd hang up immediately. Was this connected? Was the government watching me? Did I only have 7 days left to live? Well, fast forward 3 days later, and I'm just standing there listening to some music, waiting for him to pick me up and call me. He finally did and started cracking a joke about how he was glad the creepy Uber driver didn't answer. As we started chatting the shit with each other and joking around, suddenly this Indian woman walked up to me. I didn't hear what she was saying at first, since I had noise-canceling headphones. I could tell she was getting closer and closer though, and kept on calling out to me. Finally, her hey reached my ears. I looked over to her, smiled, and went back to talking to my boyfriend. She did it again though, so I excused myself. Yes, may I help you? Do you need a ride? She asked. She looked nice enough, but something was off about her. Her car was parked at the stop sign, and I could see there was someone else in it. No, my friend is coming to pick me up right now, actually. Thank you. I noticed there was a man in the driver's seat, and she wasn't wearing a uniform from either of the stores near us. She started to ask me again. Are you sure? I can give you a ride. Do you need a ride? Get in, come on, you need a ride, right? I was beginning to feel a little uncomfortable. My preschool don't get in a stranger's car training kicked in, so I politely declined again and went back to talking to my boyfriend. Hey, are you close? I just pulled out. I'll get there. Just stay on the line. That woman's gone now, right? No, she was not gone. In fact, she was standing 6 feet away glaring at me. She looked very annoyed. I told him in code that no, she had not left. She had in fact remained there leaning on the car watching me. She was looking angrier with each passing second as well. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the man tell her something. She looked at me and began to interrogate me. Your friend's not here. You need a ride? Where's your friend? He probably forgot about you. That's okay, we'll take you where you need to go. It's cold, come on, tell us where you live, we'll drop you off. At this point, she got closer to me. I tried to avoid her by moving to the farther end of the plaza strip. Honey? Yeah, so about my sister? She's gotten closer, but I'm pretty scared she's too far away from home. Something might happen. Hurry so I can tell you. I said a code as the car drove up next to me. Now she looked extremely pissed. Get in the car now. At this point, she opened the car and began trying to push me inside, pulling me, yanking on my jacket. She was a taller and bigger woman than me, so she even tried to pick me up. At this point, I'm pretty sure my bowels threatened to release. I was screaming and kicking and wiggling. Meanwhile, I could hear through the phone him yelling that he was on his way and he was calling the police. Now my mind was running 1,000 miles an hour. I was panicking, thinking I was going to be raped or presented as some weird present for her husband. He looked very content with her efforts to kidnap me. Get in! Shut up! I will hit you! I started crying as she managed to push my torso into the car. My right hand was locked to my phone. She began trying to pull it out of my hand. My boyfriend was panicking, telling me the police were sending an officer right now. She shoved my face into the leather seat. My airway was obstructed, and she was not letting me go. She was bigger than me, stronger than me, and she knew it. Her whole weight was pressing onto me. I tried not to panic so I didn't black out from lack of oxygen. All of a sudden, I started getting mad as shit. Her husband said something in Punjabi. She lifted one hand up and leaned down, trying to get something out of the front. Immediately, I used the arms I'd been using to push myself off the seat to jab her in the stomach. She recoiled, letting go of me a little. I headbutted her, tossing my melon back as I screamed, fear-stricken and adrenaline-hazed. Finally, my boyfriend pulled in. I bolted to his car, as the Indian woman was sitting stunned on the ground. After I shut the door, he sped off towards his house. When we got inside, I broke down, babbling about how scared and terrifying it all was, and how if I hadn't had that opportunity, she might have taken me to her house and done God knows what. After this incident, the police officer they dispatched got there 20 minutes later, and of course didn't find anyone. My boyfriend talked to his boss and was granted the ability to leave early to come get me. I'm still weirded out by cars stalling in the plaza. This happened about 3 weeks ago. I'm generally a slightly paranoid person as it stands already, and I've listened to many of these types of stories. I'm a small woman in her early 20s who lives alone in a smallish condo/apartment with her cat. It's on the second floor of the building, where I moved in a few months ago. There are 2 doors one must enter to get inside my apartment. First is outside leading into the building, and second is obviously my apartment door itself. Tenants have keys for the first outside door, which only has one lock, whereas the actual apartment doors have both locks and deadbolts. Otherwise, a visitor has to be buzzed in to be allowed inside. For some clarity, there are 8 apartments per building in my complex, with an outside door on either side of the building. Mine is closer to the back, and is situated directly above a currently empty space. My downstairs neighbor to the left is around my age, and the only neighbor I'm actually close with. She's often away though, staying with her boyfriend. This means that while I technically live near others, my home is very isolated. There is an outdoor light situated next to the door, but I'd noticed when returning home that the bulb had either broken or burned out, and hadn't thought to contact maintenance to fix it. It was already pretty late at night, and I was tired anyway. There hadn't appeared to be many others home in my building, as the parking lot on my side wasn't particularly full. I was taking care of a few chores around the house at around 10 p.m. It was Friday night, so I was running the dishwasher and folding up laundry. I'd had a pretty long week at school, and arrived home probably an hour to an hour and a half before. My cat was kind of keeping me company as I puttered along. It was hard to hear much outside when the dishwasher was going, and I was already distracted. But I did notice a sort of soft rustling sound coming from outside. It didn't sound too strange, aside from being fairly repetitive. I didn't really know what it was at this point, but being constantly anxious, I was too frightened of the dark to look outside the window to that side of the building. This might very well have been totally unrelated, but I still think it bears mentioning. Fast forward a bit. I was standing at my kitchen counter working on a report on my laptop. Over the sound of the dishwasher, though, I heard a soft knock on my door. I was unsure at first if I'd even actually heard anything. I went still and waited for a moment. There it was again, quiet but a little longer and faster. This made me pretty uneasy. It was late at night. My first thought was that it might be one of my neighbors. I approached the door silently and looked out the peephole. As I mentioned, the only neighbor I know well is the young woman who lives downstairs, but I am familiar with what all the others look like. The man standing outside was completely unfamiliar to me. Tall, wearing either a dark blue or black jacket, Caucasian, and with very dark hair. I had no idea who this guy was. What was very unusual was just how close he was standing to the door, even distorted through the peephole. He was so close I would guess him to be standing right up against it, leaning his face in and staring through the peephole. There was an odd sort of energy in his stance, if that makes any sense. I felt extremely unnerved. I was glad I'd made very little noise when walking over. I backed up about 3 feet from the door and waited. I'm not totally sure how much time passed, but he stood there a couple of minutes, even longer than that, before I heard him go downstairs and through the outside door. Now, I've had a neighbor from downstairs knock on my door in the evening before to ask if I was experiencing a power outage like him. He'd brought his wife with him, probably to reassure me, and had stood a reasonable distance from the door after knocking firmly. That's exactly what this strange guy didn't do. I know I'm paranoid though, so I try to convince myself I was making a big deal of nothing. I told myself this was probably just a similar situation. I was far too immediately uncomfortable though to consider answering the door. I decided to listen to my gut instead. I texted both my mom and my male friend about the situation. My friend offered to come keep me company, but by that time I had talked myself out of my nervousness and assured him I was fine. I went to sleep about an hour later and woke up having almost completely forgotten about it. Shit got weird the next day though. Only in the context of what I saw next morning did that knock begin to seem frightening. I had agreed to accompany my mom and her boyfriend to a yard sale that morning in some nearby neighborhoods. They were picking me up early, around 7:30. My mom gave me a call from her car when they arrived on my side of the building to let me know to come down. I grabbed my bag, went out my door and downstairs, but as soon as I opened the outside door, something was very clearly wrong. The handle turned very loosely in my hand, and the door popped open very easily. Upon shutting it again behind me, the handle itself completely fell out of the hole. Looking back, I wish I'd taken a picture of it, because it's a little bit hard to describe. It had obviously been tampered with. The outside portion of the door handle, held in place with screws, was now completely missing. The lock component of the handle was missing too. Essentially, all that was left behind was a stripped handle with a hole in the middle where the keyhole should be. My mom, having heard about the knocking incident from me the night before, was not cool with this all and insisted I report this. I contacted maintenance and the police, but there are no cameras situated near my apartment, and definitely not near my door. I've gotten no additional information as of now. In talking with my neighbors, who were obviously made aware of the vandalism as well, nobody who was at home or awake around that time heard anyone knock on their door, or came in contact with, or saw the man I described. Maybe I'm overthinking a bit, but this does make me nervous. It makes the approach seem much more targeted and less random, as if the person knew I'd be there alone. For what it's worth, at least the outside door handle was replaced very quickly that afternoon, and nothing like that has happened ever since. This is definitely a childhood memory of mine that I will never forget. I'm female and 22, by the way. Growing up, my aunt and uncle owned a beach condo. My favorite way to spend the summer was to stay there with my family, specifically my cousin Charlie. We were absolutely inseparable growing up. There was a 1-year difference between us. The beach we stayed at was a very popular tourist beach on the SC coast. So, in the summer, it was incredibly busy. I mean, barely any room between you and the family next to you. Now, my family would spend all day on that beach, from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. The beach would stay crowded until about 5, when everyone would go back to their rooms to shower and go out to eat. This meant from around 5 to 7 every day. That was my favorite time to be outside. We would have all the room to run wild, build sandcastles, dig huge holes. We wouldn't have to worry about people knocking them down or being too close. Around 5:30 p.m. one day, my family decided they wanted to walk to the pier about 2 miles away. Charlie and I, though, begged to stay behind so we could build sandcastles together. We were 9 and 10 at the time, so they said we could stay as long as we didn't get in the water or leave our spot. The condo we stayed at was one row back, and we were not allowed to cross the street without adults. We agreed to their terms and continued to build a row of sandcastles as they walked off into the distance. Around 5 minutes later, though, this extremely tall man wearing this floppy beach hat, sunglasses, and with a dollop of sunscreen on his nose came running straight up to us. He started by commenting how beautiful our sandcastles were, asking how long it took us to build them that high. He also asked if it was just the two of us working on them. We were both extremely introverted kids. We thanked him and kept our answers short, and tried to ignore him as he stood there watching us. All of a sudden, he got real quiet and started to glance around at the mostly empty beach. Then he said he had to go meet a friend of his. He told us to stay right there so he could bring his friend back to look at how great our sandcastles were. Then he jogged away from us. When he'd gotten a safe distance, Charlie and I both looked at each other and said, "We've gotta get out of here." Side note, hell yeah at us for being smart kids. We immediately started weighing our options. We knew our family wouldn't be back for at least another 30 minutes. We also knew we weren't allowed to cross the street, and quite frankly, we were scared to. About 100 yards away, though, was a tiny ramp overlooking the ocean. I believe it was a handicap access to the beach, as well as just a place to sit down, I guess. We grabbed our big shovels and decided to hollow out underneath that thing enough to where we could crawl under and not be seen. It didn't take us very long, since the high tide over the years had taken out a good 3 feet of sand underneath. Our adrenaline was rushing mad fast, too. We took our shovels inside with us and crawled underneath. The man was still yet to be seen. I assume it took us all of 8 minutes to climb under the pier and bury it again. Our heads were partially visible above the sand horizon, and we started freaking out, thinking he would surely be able to spot us if he just looked hard enough. There were 2 boogie boards lying about 50 feet away, though. It looked like some kids had abandoned them there. We grabbed them and propped them up against the ramp, covering our crawl space and the top of our heads from sight. Charlie curled up in a ball and cried, while running scenarios by me that we were definitely going to get taken. I tried my best to calm him down and say everything was going to be okay. Our parents would be back soon enough. I definitely felt like crying myself, though. The whole thing was so weird. I knew that since we both had such a bad feeling about the situation, especially at such a young age, this man was definitely having sinister intentions. Charles and I tried to peek out of the tiny slits where the boogie boards curved, and eventually saw the man walking back. He didn't have anyone with him, which we definitely thought he would since he said he was going to bring friends. As we observed, we noticed the man had seen we were gone. He turned around several times, checking to see if we were in the ocean or by the dunes. Once he realized and didn't seem to notice us that we were gone, he got extremely angry. He started huffing, puffing, stomping around. He looked over to our sandcastles and kicked them all down. We'd built a ton over the course of the day and basically had a gigantic wall of them. He made sure to kick every single one down before storming away. We stayed under that ramp thing for 45 more minutes until our family got back. We were way too scared to come out, especially after seeing the man's irrational reaction. We cried and told our family what had happened, and of course, they didn't believe us. We still talk about it sometimes at family gatherings or holidays. Both of us still remember it like it was yesterday. So I can't entirely say I know what's happening here, as to this day I still have no clue who did and is doing this to me. This all started when I was in 8th grade, the very first time it happened. This was a good 6 or 7 years ago, mind you. I live in a sweet southern suburb outside Austin, Texas with my family. Being as I'm the oldest of the 4 of us, I was always home alone because my siblings had parks and rec, sports, things like that, and I didn't really do any extracurriculars. It was a weeknight and my family were all at my sister's gymnastics tournament. I had been supposed to go as well, as all of the members of the family had to attend all our siblings' stuff, but I was sick. I've always been a fairly cautious creature, one who makes sure the doors are locked when I'm alone. Because of my lifelong love of anything and everything scary, naturally I had watched more than a few episodes of Criminal Minds and the like before heading to the 3rd floor, where my parents' room is, to take a bath in their fancy tub. It was about 8:30. It was in the winter as well, so it had long since gotten dark outside. About 20 minutes into my bath, though, I started to hear footsteps, loud ones like big work boots, walking up the steps. My dad, being a construction worker, did wear some big boots, so I thought it might have been him. I called out, though, and heard nothing in response. The steps kept on going, though, before reaching the top. Then all the sounds stopped and I didn't hear anything else. I turned the water off and listened for a while, but there was still nothing. I turned the water back on and went back to reading my book in the tub. The next night, one of my sisters had their final game. This game was a very late one in a town about 25 miles away, so again my family went together after making me dinner. I almost decided to go since I was feeling a little bit better, but I didn't because my mom didn't want to risk getting people outside the family sick. I really wish I had gone with them, though. Like usual, I locked up the side door and ate some ice cream while watching a bunch of scary shows. I then headed up to my parents' room to take another fancy bath and read more of my book. This time it was a bit later, though, almost around 10 or so. I was taking a very long bath and had already forgotten about the night before, until that sound happened again. I heard those same footsteps creeping up the stairs. Mind you, our stairs are hardwood, not carpet, so you could hear when someone was stepping on them quite clearly. The house was dead silent too, except the sound of the TV, which I had left turned on in the room outside the bathroom. I automatically turned the water off again and felt my heart almost stop beating. I was so scared. The footsteps this time seemed quite hurried, like the person was skipping up the steps in a rush. Once again, they stopped when they reached the top. I waited for almost 5 minutes, and nothing. I turned the water back on and picked up my old track phone and dialed my mom's number. She picked up and I started talking right away, asking if it was her. She didn't reply, but I could hear someone on the other end breathing. I started to get a bit mad. Why was she messing with me like this and not replying? All of a sudden, though, a deep voice called back through the phone, which made me almost drop it in the tub. It snapped at me. "I am not your mom." Then they hung up. As if instantly, banging started on the bathroom door. I burst into tears. This was not just knocking. They were smashing that door like it was going to fall down. This entire person's weight was being thrown into it. I dialed 911. Right when I hit send, the banging stopped and I hung up. I really didn't know if my family was just playing a trick on me. The last thing I wanted to do was have the cops come. I was already a troubled kid, so I might get in even more trouble. I stayed there in the bathroom, sitting in the corner wrapped in a towel for over 30 minutes, before I heard my family's minivan pull up into the driveway. At that moment, I started crying even more. I knew that whoever was just in my house was not a member of my family. My mom called out my name, and I responded by telling them I was upstairs. I was not leaving this room until I knew I was safe. I told her what had happened, and she didn't believe me at first. The door was still locked when they got home, so how could someone have just gotten in? It turned out she had left her phone at home on the counter by accident, so when I told her to get it, she went to right where she'd left it. There it was, sitting right on the counter. No incoming call in the phone's memory either. I showed her my phone, though, which clearly still had the outgoing call on it. This didn't add up. For a while, she thought I must have had some sort of mental break that night, or hallucinated everything. To ease my mind, though, we added a chain lock to every door in the house. For 5 years, nothing extreme like that ever happened again. Life did get pretty busy, though. I got involved in activities that made sure I was never home alone again. I joined sports in every season, volunteered, anything and everything I could do. Every month or so, though, I would hear these distinct footsteps on the porch below me. I lived on the second floor in the bedroom on the far left side directly over the front porch, so I could hear everything, even my dog sighing. It would always be someone like pacing back and forth. Then my dog would start barking and immediately the steps would stop. It got so bad one night when I was 15. I woke up myself and the twins. We all met in the hall, fully prepared to go down and attack whoever was on our porch. My brother equipped with his baseball bat. Once we got downstairs, though, it stopped. It wasn't until this last summer, just as I'd turned 18 and finished my first year of college, that the scariest moment happened to me. It was a weekend night, and my parents had gotten accustomed to going out of town pretty much twice a month, leaving me, my brother, and my sister home alone. They took my other brother, who was only 9. This night, the twins were going to a party in the neighboring town, though, and would not be coming home until the next day. I saw this as the perfect time to camp out downstairs in the living room, make a bunch of food, watch a bunch of movies, and get high. I FaceTimed my boyfriend. Somewhere into the call, though, he said something that kind of creeped me out. I really didn't think much of it at first since I was so high, but he called out to me and asked, "You're home alone, right?" I was confused and laughed. Of course I was. Why? He shook it off, saying he thought he'd seen something in the porchway behind me, but he wasn't really sure what it was. I got up right away and walked to the laundry room. I made sure the door was closed, I double-checked all the locks, I passed down at around 1 a.m., TV on and all. All of a sudden, though, I woke up to a loud banging around 3. Immediately, I was pierced with fear. It was the same loud body-slamming banging from years ago, a memory I had blocked. It started at the side door directly to my right. I couldn't move my body. I was too scared. I looked over and saw a light flashing inside, like someone was shaking a flashlight into the door. Then the same noise started at the front door, and again at the side door. All 3 doors to my house were lit up, banging so hard the entire house was shaking. Then I heard it on the front porch, like a knife or something sharp being dragged along the door. I was bawling my eyes out. I dialed 911 and started frantically explaining what was going on between my sobs. The person on the phone told me to scream out I was calling the cops, and if needed, he would send someone over. I did, and right away the house went still. Then I could hear someone laughing from all the doors, multiple different voices. This automatically made me think someone must be playing a prank on me. My friends and siblings had been known to try and scare each other. I told the man that everything seemed fine. I thought my siblings might just be playing a prank on me. I laid there and called my brother. When he answered, though, I could tell right away it was not him. I could hear the party in the background, which horrified me. I told him what had happened. The twins caught an Uber and immediately came back. We spent the rest of the night texting our friends, trying to figure out who it could have been, but nothing. Almost all our friends were accounted for at that party, nearly 20 miles away, so it couldn't have been any of them. We all slept on the couch with no more occurrences that night. It's been about 5 months since then, and I've since gone back to school. I've only come home once between then and now, and currently I'm home on winter break. Nothing else odd has happened, as I've tried not to stay home alone. Last night, though, I was awake for no reason other than scrolling around on Reddit, when around 2 a.m., I heard someone pacing back and forth on the porch. I texted my brother, and he confirmed that he heard it too. This happened to me in 2008 in Las Vegas. I was living with my husband and our son, who was about 2 years old at the time. I would frequently take our son to the grocery store early in the evening with me to do some shopping and give my husband some alone time. I never really worried much. The store was literally just outside my neighborhood, plus we lived in a very nice area. I finished up my shopping and put my son in his car seat. By the time I'd finished loading the car, he was passed out. I decided to quickly fill my tank at the gas station on the other side of the lot. While I was pumping gas, though, a big truck pulled up on the opposite side of my pump. The man pumped his gas and seemed to take no notice of me. Then he left. Just as I was finishing up though, his truck suddenly pulled up next to my car once again. The man inside, who looked like he loved his meth, said, "Excuse me, miss, but I just felt compelled to tell you how beautiful you are. As a matter of fact, the only reason I came to get gas here, it's 'cause I saw you come here from the grocery store, and I just had to be nearer to you. I've been trying to find the courage to approach you for a while, actually." I was flattered and thanked him for the compliment, but quickly informed him I was off the market. I know, it was worth a shot though. He began to pull off. Suddenly he backed up again though, and said, "If you tell your husband what I said, I'll kill him." Then he drove off. Needless to say, this freaked me out, so immediately I called my husband. He told me not to come directly home, in case the guy followed me. I drove around a bit until I felt I'd lost him, and then I went home. My husband and I went over it over and over again. How could the man possibly kill my husband if he didn't know him or even where we lived? Then, some of the things he said started to ring in my head. How he'd been watching me at the grocery store. I started to think that maybe he hadn't just meant that night. How long? How many days had he been watching me there? When I told him I was married, he said he knew. Is it possible he had followed me home on previous occasions even? We put extra locks on the doors and took extra precautions. We tried to forget about it. He was probably just some crazy guy, right? Well, about a week later, around 8 or 9 p.m., my husband decided to run up to the gas station to get some cigarettes. I was sitting on the computer in our dining room as he left through the garage door. Our son was sleeping in his bedroom on the other side of the house. About a minute after he had left, though, suddenly I heard the garage door into the laundry room open and somebody coming inside. Immediately, I assumed my husband must be grabbing something he'd forgotten. I called out to him and didn't get a response, so I called his name again. I received no answer, but I could hear someone moving around in the laundry room. I started to get worried. All the guns in the house were in our room. I would have to walk right past the laundry room to get to them. Suddenly, I heard my 2 pit bulls in my room start growling. Both dogs started barking viciously and ran toward the laundry room door, at which point I heard the laundry room door to the garage open and slam shut very quickly. At that point, I grabbed my phone. I ran into my son's room and called my husband to ask if he had just returned home for something. To my horror, he was still at the gas station. I told him someone was in the house, but I thought the dogs had scared them out. He instructed me to stay in our son's bedroom with the door closed. He was on his way home. So I sat there in the dark next to my sleeping son in sheer terror. 2 minutes later, I heard the dogs barking again and someone barging into the house through the garage door. After what felt like forever, my husband came into our son's bedroom. He checked the whole house and all around our property, but couldn't find anybody. We came to the conclusion that the stalker from the gas station must have finally taken his opportunity to catch me alone. Based on what that creepy tweaker had said to me, who else could it have been? What really freaked me out, though, is not knowing how long he had been watching me before that. How long had he been watching me before he approached me at the gas station and before he barged into our home? It really opened my eyes that someone could stalk you without you ever knowing about it until it's too late to do anything. I firmly believe my 2 pit bulls saved my life, my son's life, and possibly my husband's too that night. That had my husband not let the dogs into the house before he left, I wouldn't be here right now, nor would my son. To this day, anytime I have to be home alone, or my new husband and I are sleeping, I have to have my pit bull beside me to watch over me. My mother is a primary school teacher in a rural town in Australia. About 10 years ago, she was offered the principal position at a tiny mountain school about an hour away from where we lived. This mountain town was kind of a long-running joke for us townies. Just mentioning it would cause any local to start humming the dueling banjos theme from Deliverance. The population was just under 40 people. Most of them had the same last name, and they were all pretty well known for keeping it in the family. However, being promoted from teacher to principal was a pretty big deal for my mom. We decided we'd all live at the old schoolhouse during the week and come back to civilization on the weekends. When we arrived, I was shocked at just how small this town actually was. One street surrounded by thick scrub and brushland, dilapidated houses tucked away out of sight from the main road. No streetlights, no shops. The school was tiny, with only about 14 kids in total, and all related to each other in some way. I hate to say it, but some of the students had that Innsmouth look, if you know what I mean, that only comes with generations of kissing cousins. But overall, they were all really nice actually. All the kids behaved well, and my mom enjoyed her new job a lot. I had just finished high school and was waiting for university to start, so I spent most of my days alone in the schoolhouse reading or cooking, while my siblings were away at school and my parents were at work. However, as the weeks progressed, I found myself spending more and more time at the school itself helping Mom, because I just couldn't stand being alone there. With no TV reception and only an old Walkman and some shitty cassette tapes to fill the silence, I found myself rapidly fluctuating between bored and extremely paranoid most of the time. There were always a lot of sudden and random old house noises that really didn't sound like they were the house at all. Scratching, shuffling sounds at odd times that frequently sounded like footsteps or perhaps even voices. I tried to pass it off as paranoia for as long as I could, but shit finally hit the fan one day. I had just happened to stop my tape mid-song when I distinctly heard a man's voice quietly whispering random numbers from the front veranda. 40, 40, 9, 40, 17. I ain't afraid of no ghosts, but I am afraid of hillbilly home invasions, so I took off to the school and reported it to my mother, who of course did not believe me. Then I went to my father, who didn't believe me either. My sister did though, at least. She said she hadn't slept well since she was awoken nights before by the sound of a branch scraping on her bedroom window. Only catch was, there was no tree around. She told me she thought she had seen a man standing in the backyard late one night too, but when she mustered the courage to look once more, he was gone. Pretty soon, we were the first teenage sisters to ever insist upon sharing a room together. My parents both thought we were being ridiculous. However, one evening after dinner, we were visited by two of the local men who told them something that changed their mind. After asking if we'd had any trouble at the house, they proceeded to tell us that everyone in town had been experiencing trouble for over a month now. Apparently, these men dressed in makeshift camouflage gear had been wandering down along the main street at night. It came to the town's attention because while the town was used to strangers in hunting gear, these guys were covered in leaves and grass and sticks. No one knew who they were. Definitely not the locals of the town. There were at least 10 different people, always traveling alone, and always dressed in that same weird camouflage clothing. At first, the locals of the town were just having a laugh about it. It certainly wasn't common to see people dressed as walking bushes outside of a Warner Bros. Cartoon, even during hunting season. It was very absurd and funny, at least at first, until these guys started sneaking onto private property. One lady had woken up to find something moving under her house, shining a flashlight up through the floorboards. Another man had come home to find a camouflaged guy hiding crouched on his roof. One man heard muttering from his back porch, only to go out and discover that someone had unchained his hunting dogs from their run and tied them to his back doorknob, then drawn a large X on the door. Pretty much every local had been terrorized by one of these guys in the night, and some of them even brazenly during the day. The local guys were really nice actually, and warned my dad to keep things locked up tight and stay vigilant, and let them know if anything happened. Over the course of the next month, many similar events occurred. My mother even saw one of the men hiding on the edge of the school grounds during the day and called the police. The sightings were frequent, as were the chalk X's. One of the locals even saw a man in camouflage standing on his front lawn whimpering like an animal in the early hours of the morning. The local guy who'd seen him threatened him, while his wife called the police, but the man silently stood his ground, smiling at them in the dark. The local man eventually lost his cool and beat the heck out of this creeper, who stood there smiling and laughing through the entire beating, then just got up and walked calmly back into the bush, still smiling and even bleeding before the police arrived. Unfortunately, there's not really a cool ending to this story. The school closed not long after due to government funding cuts, and my mom got a new job closer to home, which meant we left pretty quickly. We moved back home after spending only 5 months up in mountain country, and no one in the family was too sorry about that. I often wonder who those guys were to be out there in the middle of nowhere, and why were they doing all of that exactly? A few years ago, I was leaving my grad school office late, around 10 p.m. to catch the bus home. I walked from the university campus via relatively busy, well-lit streets to the main north-south road in my area of the city. I was waiting for the bus at a shelter, as it was in the middle of winter and snowing. It was fairly cold. The bus ran about every 15 minutes, so I wasn't really worried or nervous or anything, just kind of patiently waiting there to get on my way home. I was listening to my music with my headphones in when I noticed a guy walk up to the shelter. I looked at him briefly, did that little Canadian half smile of acknowledgement, and went right back to listening to my music and reading through Reddit. A few minutes passed by and I could hear him start talking to me now. Well, I assumed it must be me. I was the only one around. I looked up and the man was staring at me, smiling a bit oddly and speaking to me as well. I took out my headphones. Excuse me? He kept on smiling and blathering on, asking me about my day, the weather, what I like to do, etc. I don't know what it is about me, or perhaps people in general, but I'm a perennial people pleaser. I don't like confrontation, and my main aim in life seems to be to keep the peace at all times. So I answered a few of his questions politely and as non-specifically as I could, with one of my earbuds still in. He just kept on blathering on and on though. At this point I just kind of tuned him out and nodded politely. This went on for about 10 minutes, when I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach about this guy. Like I could tell something was just a little bit off now, enough to make me start getting nervous. After about 10 minutes, I could see the bus rolling on its way up, which was a huge relief for me. No one else had arrived at the bus stop that entire time. Luckily, I could see at least 10 to 15 people were already on, which was great for me. I hopped on the bus and sat near the front. The guy sat across from me, so he could keep on talking to me. I had originally intended to head right to my house, to the west of the street I was on, but after this guy decided to be my personal parrot, I decided to go to my boyfriend's instead. Pretty much in exactly the opposite direction. I was still getting an uncomfortable feeling from this guy, so I decided I would push the bus stop button a stop early, just to see what this guy would do. The bus came to a stop at my request, and the man got up immediately. I didn't move.
"Oh, isn't this your stop too?"
he asked me. Oh, whoops. I must have hit the wrong stop button on accident. I'm kinda tired, The man looked at me.
"Oh, well, that's funny. I must have mixed it up too, because this isn't my stop either."
He sat back down right behind me. At this point, I was pretty freaked out. I hit the bus stop for the next stop and texted my boyfriend to come and meet me at 109th Street. I got up to leave once the bus stopped, and the creepy man followed close behind. I crossed the road and he still followed, still jabbering away at me, asking me all kinds of questions. Once I got to the other side of the road, I told him I had to go now, and my boyfriend was meeting up with me. He looked irritated at even the idea of me having a boyfriend, and tried to follow me more. I stopped and told him I was going alone from here on out.
"Well, can I have your number?"
he asked. I panicked. I kind of froze. I gave him almost my number, with the last 4 digits completely scrambled around. I read it off to him, said goodnight, and started walking away really quickly. I had almost started running, and had made it 20 steps away, I could hear him now jogging after me.
Hey! I think there was a mix-up. I tried calling that number and it wasn't you.
He jogged right up next to me and was still smiling, that same weird smile, staring at me. How weird, I said, grabbing my phone. I pretended to check it for a missed call and texted my boyfriend that I needed him to come right now. The man leaned in.
So, what's your real number then?
He asked. I honestly don't know what I would have done. I think I would have just given it to him. I had no idea what to do. It was extremely cold, it was winter, and it was dark in this tiny residential neighborhood I had entered. I knew I couldn't outrun him. Luckily for me, at that exact moment, my boyfriend came sprinting up. He was fairly large and somewhat imposing. I turned around to the man and said, "Have a good night." I jogged up to my boyfriend and launched myself at him. I didn't look back at the creepy dude, but I did tell my boyfriend to please make sure the doors were all locked and the windows all closed before we went to bed that night. My family grew up in the rural area around where we lived. My parents weren't rich or anything, but we did have a fairly decent life. This was in the 70s or so things were a lot different than they are nowadays. It was a lot more common back then to see someone driving down a country road with an open beer between their legs. Although I don't live out in the country now, nor have I in quite a long time, I at least like to think that things like that don't happen nearly as often anymore. I learned to drive myself when I was about 12 years old. This was not unusual for me or my family. And it wasn't too strange either for one of us to take the car out and go somewhere. I had a lot of friends my age who chewed tobacco as well. I tried it a few times, but I didn't really care for it. Around this time, I was good friends with a guy named Vance. We had grown up in the same general area up on the ridge. Our houses weren't really that close together, but we rode the same school bus to school. We were friends all the way from kindergarten until sometime in high school. The reason the two of us stopped being friends in high school was due to a girl he had liked for years liking me even more. Although I wasn't really interested in her and would never have dated someone my friend had his eye on, this made him really angry. After a while, he just kind of stopped talking to me. A while further after that, he became very antagonistic to me as well, which was pretty horrible because no one wants to lose a friend in a situation like that. It's not like I made the girl like me or something. When I was 17 years old, I was home by myself on a weekend night. I decided to take one of the old cars and see a different buddy of mine who lived a bit further up the ridge than I did. It was about an hour's drive to his house, since it was a dark dirt road the entire way there. You had to be real careful out on some of these roads. They were right on the sides of hills, and there was not anything like a guardrail to keep you from driving off the side and dying. When I left that friend's house to go home, it was already pretty late. I went outside and could see it was actually a little bit foggy out. It was not ideal to drive this path in that weather, but it just meant I would have to take my time and be more careful when driving. However, it was not too long after I'd begun that I noticed some lights behind me. Another vehicle was now coming my way. The road wasn't really wide enough for more than a car and a half, so this person could not pass me by. Still though, he didn't stop at all. He drove up upon me really fast. In fact, just before he slowed down, I almost thought he was going to slam into me and shove me off the cliff. He had gotten as close as possible to hitting me, then backed off just a bit. When this person was about a car's length behind me, he started to flash his high beams on. Then he sped up just enough to almost slam into me again. Just before he'd hit me though, he slowed down. Now he kept his high beams on, which made it very difficult for me to see the path ahead. I tried to pull my car over just a bit to let this guy pass me by. I was really trying to let him go, assuming that's what he wanted. This guy made no attempt to pass me though. He did the exact same thing, pulled up really close to me, then backed off again. This time he began to honk his horn angrily as well. I began to get very nervous. Every time this guy repeated this pattern, I got even more scared. I tried to speed up now, which I was very hesitant to do. I didn't like driving fast down these roads, even when there was not any fog. That didn't change anything though. When I sped up, he matched me perfectly. He kept getting close as if he was going to hit me off the side before backing off yet again. He did this over and over, while still honking his horn at me. I don't know how long this kept up, but finally we got into the bottom of the hill, so there was no risk of running off the side anymore. We were still in a highly forested area though. Thankfully, by that point I was not far away from home. I thought I could make it there, and at least I knew my family would be home by then. If this guy followed me all the way home, my brothers would be there to help me kick the crap out of him. No sooner than that thought entered my head, however, the car did its same pattern again. This time, though, it did hit me. I reacted by slamming the brakes, which caused my car to spin and skid off the road. The only thing I remember after that was nothing. I woke up in the hospital 3 months after the accident. My car had slammed right into a big tree. I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt in that moment. The only thing that kept me from flying through the windshield was the big steering wheel that my head and chest had bounced off of. I had some pretty bad head injuries, and I had been out for the entire time. I guess I had opened my eyes after a month, but had not been acting like myself. They told me I was aware, but it was like nobody was there. I don't really remember exactly because it was so many decades ago. I had a violent and sort of feral behavior that required me to be restrained to my bed for a while. Then, suddenly one day, the day I felt like I woke up, I just went back to normal. I never found out exactly who was driving that car that rammed me. However, some other people who knew me in high school later told me that Vance had been bragging that it was him after it happened. Vance's dad worked at the police department, so there was never an investigation to see if he had done it. That, of course, convinced me that he had. I don't live out in the country anymore, but I really hope it's harder these days for crooked people to get away with things like that now. I'm a 28-year-old man from England. Near the end of August, I was out with some friends in a bar to celebrate my birthday. It was near the end of the night, and we decided it was time to go home, having been out for about 8 hours going on this point. We were up to the first floor of the bar, and my friends went down the staircase to the main doors ahead of me. For reasons my advanced drunkenness has caused me to forget since, I decided to try taking a shortcut off the stage next to the stairs instead. I'm guessing I just stepped off the stage thinking it was a short drop to the ground. It was closer to about 5 or 6 feet, and I hit the ground dead on with my legs straight and my knees locked. I heard a snap. Well, I knew instantly something was seriously wrong there. Cue a 999 call and a surprisingly calm ambulance ride to the hospital after being dosed up on gas and air. When we arrived, they gave me a thorough x-ray and discovered I'd broken both of my legs like a dumbass. By this point, I'd sort of already guessed though. Your right foot pointing down instead of up is a pretty good indication something's really wrong. My heart sank even further when the attending doctor told me they'd have to admit me ahead of corrective surgery in the next couple of days. By now, they'd given me quite a bit of morphine. I was still huffing gas and air like a champ as well, so I was fairly out of it. A porter wheeled me up to the ward and introduced me to a nurse, who explained I was going to be put into the men's ward, as they'd had to separate genders the previous day into different rooms. Even out of it on pain meds, I remember thinking that was quite a weird thing to mention. My nurse set me up in my room right by the ward entrance. My bed was one of 5 in there, and was next to the room's shared toilet/shower room. It was around 5 a.m. now, and the entire place was quiet and dark. As the nurse took me through all the admittance procedures, I could vaguely make out a guy in the opposite bed. Unlike the others in the room, he was awake and sitting up in his bed to watch me being brought in. I couldn't quite see his face, but the patchy white hair on his head was catching the moonlight coming in from the windows, so he must have been an older guy. What struck me as odd, though, was how he was just sitting there, completely still like a statue. No movement, no noise. I couldn't even hear him breathing. He was just sitting there focused on me the entire time. Before the nurse left, I asked him to draw the curtain around me so I would be shielded from view, and eventually I managed to drift off to sleep. I woke up the next day to find my parents had been contacted and were sitting by my bed. Standing next to them was the guy from the bed opposite, chatting away like they'd known each other for years. I'm not exactly known as a people person, and given that for obvious reasons I was quite a touch grouchy, I'll admit that I was annoyed my parents were letting a total stranger stand right over me while I was unconscious. Of course, there's no way they could have really known that he'd creeped me out a little the night before. The man introduced himself. Here we'll call him Mick. He seemed friendly enough, one of those harmless old men who comes across as lonely, and is just keen to talk to just about anyone. I found out he was in his early 70s, quite short and round, and was on the ward because he'd fractured his collarbone in a fall. When he eventually wandered off, my parents told me he seemed to be a nice man, confirming he just appeared pleased to have any new people to talk to at all. During the course of that first day, my parents eventually left. The doctors came around to fit me up with splints before my surgery, planned for day 3. They made it clear I'd be in the hospital for at least a week or so, and I would not be walking for a few months at the very least. Not what I wanted to hear. During all of these conversations, Mick was always lurking nearby, listening in. When the doctors left, he came right to my bedside. Rather than stand, he sat down in the chair next to me and asked me to repeat what the doctors had said. I wasn't in much of a mood to chat, and because I got it into my head that he was harmless, I asked why he'd need to know. He'd only been standing a few feet away, and obviously he must have heard everything. The second those words left my lips, though, his entire demeanor changed immediately. The sweet old man that had been sitting in that chair just beside me was gone. His face went blank and flattened out. He fixed me with this strange stare, and one corner of his mouth lifted into a lopsided grin. My wife just died, you know. Again, I'm not a people person, and conversations about death are certainly way outside my wheelhouse. I stuttered a little, trying to find appropriate words. I was starting to say how sorry I was to hear that, and asked how long it had been. Given the odd grin, I guessed it had been quite a while. About 3 weeks, just like that, gone. His face never changed the whole time. It dawned on me now that maybe he was not totally mentally present at that point. He never broke eye contact either, just staring at me grinning. One of those looks that wasn't immediately sinister, but goes on for too long, you know. Thankfully, the nurses came in at that point to serve dinner, and Mick retreated back to his bed. He watched the TV the rest of that day. I put my iPod on so I had an excuse to not make any more conversation. Right then, I just thought he was a little left of normal, and it was more weirdness that I could certainly deal with. When the lights out came around, I asked the nurses to draw the curtains closed around my bed for me. Although I was still in quite a bit of pain, I drifted off early. During the night, though, I was suddenly woken up in what had to have been the early hours of the morning. One of those gradual awakenings where you know something's not quite right, but you're not present enough to work out what yet. The ward was almost totally dark and silent again, especially around my bed with the curtains drawn. I assumed the weird feeling was down to, being in the hospital with 2 graphically shattered legs, and turned my head to the left onto the pillow. Then I nearly rolled off the opposite side in complete shock. Standing inside of the drawn curtains, right next to my bed, was Mick, just standing there watching me sleep. Like you do when you've had a shock. I said something stupid. "Hey, this isn't where you sleep." Nothing. That same blank stare, barely a ruler length from my face. I thought he might just be sleepwalking, but he didn't have that glazed-over look in his eyes to go with it. He seemed perfectly alert, just happy to stand there observing me. "Mick, how long have you been standing there?" That's when I got a special kind of chill, the kind you get when something really freaks you out. Rather than reply, he smiled so wide. I saw both rows of his teeth. He shuffled back around the curtain to his own bed. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Because he'd never left the room, and I certainly wasn't going to be going anywhere on my own, I couldn't really mention it to the nurses. I did text a few friends who were visiting the next day, and told them to watch out for him when they came through. He stayed away during their entire visit though, and acted like a normal old innocent man. As the day went on, I decided I must have made more of it than I should have. Perhaps I was just on edge because of what I had going on, and being in unfamiliar surroundings. That day I went in for my surgery. I came to about 6 hours later to find myself hooked up to a morphine pump. As a result, I was completely out of my tree high the entire evening, and was in such a good opiate-fueled mood I totally forgot about Mick. Big mistake. It got to the early hours again. I was playing a game on my phone, oblivious. The nurses were checking in every hour or so. They disturbed the curtains around my bed a lot as they'd come and go. The last nurse had left a gap about 6 inches wide where the curtains met, typically right in the part opposite Mick's bed. Mick was normally a very, very loud snorer, so I was reassured by the noises coming from him that he must be asleep at this point. I've got to assume because of the morphine that I stopped paying attention. Suddenly, I realized I was acutely aware that I couldn't hear the snoring any longer. I also couldn't remember how long it had been since I last heard it. Nervously, I looked at the gap between the curtains, but I couldn't make anything out. I was just about to write it off and go back to my game, when just left of the gap, I could hear my name being called out. Not the normal way of saying it, not a whisper, more like a sinister groan almost, low and gravelly and menacing. I froze. I mean, what's the protocol when a pensioner has gotten out of bed in the middle of the night for the second night running to mess with you? I sat there paralyzed. More paralyzed than I already was because of my legs. I was suddenly aware of my sense of vulnerability. I was completely immobile. It's not like I could get up and leave or something. I was stuck in my bed with heavy bandages and braces around both of my legs, hooked up to an IV. I slowly moved my hand down from my phone to push the call button for the nurses. Just as my hand reached it, the long groaning of my name stopped, and so had my hand. Had he seen me reach out for it and gone back to bed? No, he was still there. About 30 seconds passed by, presumably the length of time it took him to notice I was not going to press the button yet. Then came the heavy breathing, low rasping intakes of air, followed by extending groans to expel it, over and over, right from underneath the foot of my bed. That was my limit. I hit the call button and the light went on above my head. I heard the buzzer sound down the hallway at the nurse's station. There was a burst of movement behind my curtains, and I heard the nearby toilet door quickly open and close. Not long after, a nurse responded. Mick was still in the toilet, but because it was close by, I beckoned the nurse nearer so I could whisper. I told her what was going on this night and the previous, and asked if something could be done. She nodded and said she'd be right back. While she was gone, Mick emerged from the toilet. I heard him quietly crawl back into his bed and pretend to be asleep. Thankfully, the nurse had fully closed my curtains, so at least he could not see me now. An hour passed by, and eventually the nurse returned. I was expecting to be moved elsewhere, but instead she told me I couldn't have a sleeping pill due to being on morphine. I tried my best not to be impolite. I calmly told her I had not asked for a pill. I asked for something to be done about Mick. The last thing I wanted in this situation was to knock myself unconscious with even more meds. She just sort of shrugged and half explained that all of the wards were full. Then she disappeared, telling me to get some rest. Needless to say, I could not sleep for hours. Mick's snoring eventually resumed, and the day finally caught up with me. I cautiously allowed myself to drift off. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Mick made small talk, which I didn't really respond to, and eventually left me alone. That afternoon, a guy younger than me was admitted with a broken leg as well. This guy was 18, but looked about 12. It was absolutely ridiculous. Mick didn't seem to think so, though. Suddenly, this guy was the focus of all his attention. I felt sorry for the fresh meat, but grateful I might be able to relax now. That night I slept pretty well, until about 3 a.m. I was suddenly awoken to the weird sensation on my left foot, the toes of which were poking out of the top of my bandages. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw Mick standing there inside of my drawn curtains, playing with my toes, running his fingers along them, brushing them, pinching them, moving them around, like he'd wanted me to wake up and see what he was doing. He was not looking at my feet, though. He was staring me dead in the eyes, unblinking. I'd like to say I lost my shit with him, called the nurses in, and had him moved elsewhere immediately. But the mind's a weird thing, so that's not what I did. I just sat there open-mouthed and watched him as he kept rubbing his hands along my feet. I think it was disbelief that kept me quiet, mixed with fear of what he would do. He might have had more than 40 years on me, but I was completely trapped and totally at his mercy. Needless to say, I didn't want to do anything to piss him off. Eventually, he seemed to get tired of messing with me and disappeared behind the curtains once more. For obvious reasons, I sat awake for the rest of the night, watching and waiting for him to show his face again. Every now and then, I could hear my name being groaned out. By morning, it was a mixture of furious and terrified. I'm not the kind of person who assumes the role of victim very often, so I hated how easily this old man had reduced me to a paranoid wreck. Every time he got up to stretch his legs or get some water, my entire body would go rigid, expecting him to appear at my bedside once more. Instead, he went back to devoting all of this creepy attention to the new guy again. That afternoon, Mick was called away for a scan, so I finally had some time to speak to the 3 other guys in the room about what had happened. None of them had any idea about Mick's nightly visits. One of the guys had been there a lot longer than I had, though. He had been around when the wards were divided by gender. I asked him about what had happened. To cause this. He responded that he wasn't totally sure. He just knew that something had happened during the night, and the very next morning everyone had been in separate wards. For obvious reasons, I had a pretty good idea of what that something might have been. When Mick got back, he glumly announced he had been cleared to go home, and had an ambulance booked to take him there in an hour or 2. He started making his way around the ward, saying goodbye to everyone, and he left me till the very last. He placed his hand on my foot. "You look after those legs in the future. They're fragile things, you know." I half smiled and told him I hoped he felt better soon. I was assuming the interaction was the last one I'd have. I'd finally seen the last of this man. I picked up a magazine and started reading. No sooner than I had done that, though, I looked up. I was about to yell out until I saw what Mick was doing. His hand was clamped around my foot, squeezing it so hard his knuckles had gone white. Thankfully, this was not the area where the break was, or that might have seriously damaged me. After that, his stare was back, completely vacant. Before I could respond, his mouth opened, and out came the same raspy voice I'd heard saying my name in the night. "They're very, very fragile." He let go of my foot and turned around, then shuffled back to his bed to pack. A couple of hours after that, he was finally gone. I did fill the nurses in before I was discharged, but none of them seemed to care all that much. They dismissed what I'd experienced as either partly drug-induced or just misinterpreted behavior. This happened a while back when I was 15 years old. I just discovered the rebellious act of sneaking out. This was probably my 4th or 5th time doing so, I believe. This one night, I decided to go and meet up with my boyfriend. At this point in time, we weren't together yet, but we really knew we liked each other. You know how that sort of thing goes. When you're with someone you like, you tend not to really pay attention to what's going on around you. The night started out pretty fine, actually. We were both having a very good time. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, because we had both gotten pretty damn high. I do remember what happened, though. We'd met up and snuck to this elementary school that had a decent-sized field, with some hills and trees toward the end of it. From where we were sitting, we had a very clear view of the school, as well as the basketball court. The school was illuminated from the side lights, so we could easily see anyone walking by. It wasn't easy for people to see us laying there, though. To our left was a little pavement path that led to a townhouse complex. So here we are, sitting at the edge of this field, just gazing out at the stars and talking about random shit together, when we started to hear the crunch of gravel coming from the school. Because we were both high and paranoid, we immediately turned our attention to the illuminated basketball court. We watched as a man walked by with his bike and didn't seem to notice us. After he passed by, we almost instantly forgot about it and resumed talking, laughing, and being a bit loud. Perhaps 10 minutes later, though, we hear that same crunch of gravel go by. We go silent immediately and look out toward the school. Once again, it was that same guy. This time, though, when he reached the courts, he didn't keep on walking. He stopped at the edge of the field we were sitting on and stared out at it for maybe a minute or so. It looked like he was searching for us. We were a little bit creeped out at this point, so we started to quietly pack up our things to leave. All of a sudden, the man began to walk towards us. As soon as he'd stepped out onto the field, it became so much more difficult to see him. The light from the school couldn't reach that area. We took this as our cue to get the hell out of there. The only way to leave without being extremely visible was to take the path into the townhouses. We jumped up and tried our best to be quiet. We walked through the pitch-black path that led to the townhouse complex. We were not sober, by the way, so we were extra freaked out. I kept on checking behind us constantly. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling something bad was going to happen. We finally reached the end of that pitch-black path and made it to the decently lit complex. We started to ease up a little bit and began trying to find our way to the main exit. That was the closest way out besides the way we'd come in. As we were walking throughout the complex, we started to relax and talk a bit more. Once we turned the corner to leave, though, just as we were about to reach the exit, we saw the same man with his bike waiting there for us at the exit. We stopped for maybe 2 seconds. The man dropped his bike on the ground and started to sprint directly at us. I muttered a quick, "Oh shit!" My boyfriend and I began sprinting as fast as we could away from this guy. We turned down random corners and down little back alleys, not once checking behind us. I don't know when or where we lost him, but we became very tired. We had to stop and hide in some bushes. We noticed after a while that there was no man in sight anymore. Still though, we stayed in that same position for about 20 more minutes, just trying to calm down. At this point, we had both pretty much sobered up, so we decided to try and leave once again. We began walking through the complex once more. When we made our way back to the main entrance, we both saw the man's bike was now gone. We were unsettled by this. We had no clue where the guy could be, or when he was going to just randomly appear again. Lucky for both of us, though, we made it home safe and sound that night. I'll never forget the feeling, though, of my heart sinking when we saw that guy blocking our way out. By far one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. So this happened to me in 2009. I was 22 at the time, but I'm very short and small, and can oftentimes be mistaken for a young teenager. I had just had a driving lesson, and while normally my instructor would drop me off in front of my home at the end, that day he had somewhere to be straight after, so he dropped me off at a nearby bus stop instead. My apartment block was about 500 meters away, at the end of a very long stretch of quiet road. It was an area that was still being built up at the time, so all there really was a couple of abandoned old houses to the left and right, my apartment block at the very end, and that's pretty much it. It was rare to ever see cars going there that weren't just going straight to the apartment block, because really there was nothing there to go to. Maybe a clinic a couple of streets away. So you would occasionally get someone who was lost looking for directions to that place. It was around 8 p.m., and it had just gotten dark outside. The street was barely lit. Still though, it only took a few minutes to get from the bus stop to my house, so I really didn't think that much of it. That was until a car drove past me, but then started backing up in the middle of the street until it was driving slowly right beside me. I looked over and could see a woman was driving. There was a man in the passenger seat. I sort of slowed down, thinking they were going to ask me for directions to the clinic. The woman instead asked this: "Do you live here?" Now I was thinking they definitely wanted directions. I stopped to help them, but then she said, "It looks like you're lost. We're the police. We're gonna take you home now." Mind you, this was a totally normal vehicle. These people weren't in uniform or looking in any way official. I was incredulous. I was literally stunned. All I could say was something like, "You're taking the piss." Immediately, I was thinking these people must have mistaken me for a 10-year-old or something and were trying to kidnap me. The woman was getting very agitated. She kept on telling me, "You have to respect the police. Get in the car right now." I was shocked. I was angry. At this point, the car stopped. I saw the woman moving to open the door. I burst into the fastest sprint of my life while fumbling with my phone to call my mom. I screamed at her to buzz me in because I was in danger. My dad ran out of the house to meet me and started to look for them immediately after, but the car was already nowhere in the area. He informed the police, but nothing ever came of it. Years ago, I lived in a condo with just my two dogs, Smokey and the Bandit, brother and sister from the same litter I'd gotten as puppies. For reference, their mother was a Sheltie, Smokey's father was a German Shepherd, and Bandit's was a Husky. They were both good-sized with long, thick coats, which made them look a lot bigger than they actually were. Personality-wise, though, they were both big babies who loved people and attention, and would happily lick you to death if given the chance. One night, I got home late, around 2:30 in the morning. I took them out for a quick run and a piss, something I had done many times before. I lived in the back side of the condo on the ground level. The backyard was basically a huge park-like setting, divided into intersecting pathways, kind of like a square with 4 quadrants. That was surrounded by other condos and houses. The area in front of mine was a big field with a pathway about halfway through, running just parallel to the condo. To the left of that was an area around the same size, divided between a large playground area and a big forest with a pathway running through it. I headed straight out of my condo and across the pathway that divided that big open field. That was when I noticed someone, a tall, skinny man, dressed all in black, whistling while walking along the path I had just crossed over. As I ran with my dogs, I noticed the whistling had suddenly stopped. I looked back over my shoulder, only to see the man had diverted off the path as soon as I was in front of him and was now walking in a direct line towards me. Immediately, I thought to myself, "Oh shit, this can't be good." I took a hard left and ran to the playground area. It was well lit, but there were also big hills I assume were leftover dirt from construction or something. I ran around that hill into the dark, where I thought he wouldn't be able to see me. I stayed there in the dark for a minute, trying to formulate a plan. Luckily, I knew the area very well, having spent hours walking everywhere with the dogs. I snuck towards the forested area, creeping towards the trees to where the path ran through, circling back around towards my condo. I kept close to the shadows, while praying that I had lost him. The forested area ended basically where the backyard of my condo began. Still hidden in the darkness, I looked around the open area ahead. I couldn't see anyone. I made a break for it, and started running out of the forest like hell. Up to this point, it was just like any other walk for my dogs, who'd happily galloped alongside me the entire time, seemingly unaware of any danger. As soon as I left the protection of the forest, though, I saw that fucker jump out of waiting from a nearby group of bushes. I had a good head start on him, thankfully, but I didn't know how fast this guy was. I kept on running. What happened next still amazes me to this day. As I was running, the dogs still at my side. Smokey all of a sudden stopped dead in her tracks, turned around and assumed a snarling stance. She began to growl at the man, which stopped him dead in his tracks. Bandit stuck right by my side like glue until we got to my patio. I turned around and looked back, almost laughing at that fucker. Smokey was standing her ground in full-on guard dog mode, while the man was standing there looking at her, hands up in surrender. I called Smokey to come back to me. She backed away slowly, barking and growling at the man, until she decided it was finally good. She turned around and ran right back to me. I kept my eyes on that guy the entire time. He never moved until the dogs went back inside, at which point I followed them soon after. I immediately called 911, and within minutes the entire backyard area was swarming with cops. The cop who interviewed me said there had been numerous reports of sexual assaults in that area, and they figured it was all that same guy. Unfortunately, other than tall, skinny, and wearing all black, I had zero info on what the man looked like. I don't know if they ever caught him or anything more on it really. When everyone was gone, I had a good long cuddle with my wonder dogs, complete with them licking away my tears. After the adrenaline and everything wore off, the gravity of what could have happened and how damn lucky I was finally hit me. I got off work at around 10 p.m. and headed home. I lived alone and always made sure my front door was locked before I left. When I arrived home, though, I found the door was now unlocked. I knew for a fact I had locked up tight when I left, because like I stated, I always double check. I have severe OCD and would not have forgotten to do so. I was too obsessed with my routine to ever forget. I was thoroughly unsettled by this. Immediately, I retrieved my pistol from the drawer right next to my front door. I set down my bag of fast food and looked around the dark living room, fumbling for the light switch. Once the light flicked on, to my utter horror, my apartment was in complete disarray. Paperwork thrown all over the floor that had been put away in my office. My social security card lying out in the open, and my birth certificate too. I quickly made my way to my office. Once I entered the room, I found all the drawers were open. My computer had been turned on, and it was at the lock screen, as if someone had been trying to log into it. I checked the rest of my apartment, but I didn't find anyone there. I put my gun back and immediately phoned the police. They arrived fairly quickly and took a report of the break-in. They asked me if I had any enemies, or if I'd made anyone mad recently. I responded that I hadn't. No such thing had occurred. And furthermore, I'm not the type of person that quarrels often with people. Needless to say, I was quite dumbstruck as to what I'd stumbled home to. I cleaned up the mess and attempted to go to sleep, but I tossed and turned most of the night, laying with my gun under my pillow. I'd like to add that I was already a somewhat paranoid person, so the whole thing naturally freaked me out. The next day I had off, so I left to go hiking with my girlfriend. I left around 9 a.m. and stopped by the Starbucks right next to my apartment. While I sat in the busy drive-thru line, I looked up, only to notice a man staring at me from across the street, on the same side as my apartment complex. The strangest thing about looking at this man was, though, just how much of a resemblance to me he bared. The guy had done up his hair the exact same way as me. He was about the same height and weight, too. He even wore the same glasses and looked to be about the same age as well. He didn't have any expression on his face, just stood there still as a statue staring at me. It was my turn to grab my order, so I grabbed my stuff, and when I went to pull out of the drive-thru, the man was now gone. The day went on as planned, and my girlfriend and I had a very great day together. I told her about the incident at my apartment previously, and the weird man who looked just like me. She joked that perhaps my doppelganger had broken into my apartment or something. After I parted ways with my girlfriend and made my way home, I was a little bit nervous to return there, fearing that whoever had broken in before might have returned. Whatever they had been there for that night, they seemed to be looking for something in particular. I arrived at my apartment and made my way back to my unit. I lived upstairs, and as I approached those stairs to my front door, I could hear someone moving around upstairs. I was a good distance from the stairwell at this point and was alarmed. I didn't have any neighbors that lived upstairs, so no one should have been up there. I stopped to see who it was, and to my shock, it was none other than that same man I'd seen earlier that morning. He walked fairly quickly, and it looked like he was trying to be as quiet as possible. I shouted at the man to stop, but as soon as he heard me, he took off running. He hopped the fence that separated the complex from a large field and disappeared into the night. I ran upstairs to my apartment and tried the doorknob, once again unlocked. I went inside and was horrified. All over the walls of my living room were pictures of me and my girlfriend from that day. Pictures that looked as if they'd been taken right from the tree line next to the trail she and I were on. I once again called the police. They came and searched the apartment, as well as the entire complex. I told them about the man I'd seen running into the field. When they searched it, they returned with a pair of eyeglasses and a wig. The police took the items they found into evidence and opened up a case. They stationed 2 cars outside my apartment and informed the manager about what was going on. It's been almost a week since this started, and nothing else had happened since. No more random break-ins or creepy photos of my girlfriend and I. To be fair though, I'd been staying with a coworker of mine until things died down. I have no idea why whoever this is targeting me. Based on the items the police found in the field, my guess is this person is trying to pretend to be me for some odd reason. I don't know what that means. I have 2 Australian Shepherds. One is my personal dog and the other is a foster dog. Both are roughly around 60 pounds. I took them on a walk today at a local wilderness area that consists of about 50 miles of trails in total. I'd been there many times with my dogs and never had any problems. Anyways, we're walking down the trail, and they did bark at the few people we saw. Every time I saw someone, we'd step to the side off the trail and let them pass me by. I'd apologize to them, the person would smile and keep on walking, and we'd all carry on with our merry days. So when I see this one guy approaching, and the dogs go into alert mode, we stepped off the path so he could pass us by. The man instead walked up to us and then stopped in place. "Oh, I don't think your dogs like me." I told him they were just nervous around everyone. I apologized for them being so loud. At this point, I was barely able to hold them by their harnesses, so they were super close to me. They were going absolutely crazy. They were angry even. I know it was not great behavior, but nonetheless. The man began to whisper, "I'm sorry they don't like me. I'm so sorry." At this point, I was weirded out. He'd not broken eye contact with me or blinked at all, and seemed rather unfazed by the dogs all said. I again told him it was not his fault. I told the dogs to go with me, and began to guide them away. The man told me he was going to keep moseying on up the trail. I said alright and told him to have a good day, and we walked off in opposite directions. I thought it was a very strange interaction, but hey, we can all be a little bit weird at times. I tried not to think too much of it. About 2 minutes later though, I heard the man suddenly call out from behind me, and I turned around to see him quickly approaching. "Hey, I really want to be friends with your dogs. I don't want to leave them on bad terms. I want to make some new friends." He walked right up. If I came upon nervous dogs, I'd always leave them alone, or if I did try to make friends, I'd squat down, talk gently to them, extend a hand. He never did this, though. He never even looked at the dogs, because he was staring at me without blinking once the entire time. This time, the dogs went absolutely nuts again. I didn't grab their harnesses, though. I let them have the full length of the leash to put some distance between me and this man. The man was going insane, shouting now how he just wanted to be friends. I told him I didn't think that was going to happen. He tried to approach still, but the dogs were having none of that. He began to whisper to himself, "I'm sorry, I don't think they're going to be friends with me." Again, he was not even looking at them though. He was just staring at me unblinking. I told him to go away. He finally turned around and left, and I called my sister for the remainder of the walk. It was so strange. I guess I don't know for a fact that that man had bad intentions, but I'm sure glad that my dogs were there and made it abundantly clear he was not going to follow me anymore. This happened 3 years ago, while a former relationship of mine was ending. I was 27 years old at the time. My ex-boyfriend and I weren't living together anymore. We were separated for a few months, but not quite broken up yet. I had just found out from his twin brother that he was keeping me as a backup while having fun with other girls. I decided to end things because of this. It was my birthday, and I was a bit emotional about this whole situation, so I decided to go to his place and end it properly face to face. I took an Uber driver there and went to the other side of town. It was very far away from where I lived, and in a not-so-safe-for-girls area. I got there, and we talked, ended things on good terms given the situation, and now it was time to call an Uber to go back home. It was November on a rainy night, and we had talked for so long it was about 2 a.m. now. My ride came and I hopped in. I was looking out the window and thinking upon what had just happened. After 5 minutes or so, though, I noticed my Uber driver was staring at me in the rear-view mirror every second he could, whenever he could take his eyes off the road. I brushed this off at first. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and honestly I was too sad to care. But I started to notice that he was slowing down a lot. This is when I started to pay attention to my surroundings as well. I noticed that he was tall and very thin. He looked like he didn't take very good care of himself, and his car was actually pretty filthy. Out of nowhere, he started talking to me. "You are so beautiful." Thanks? What's your name?" I whispered my name after a long pause. "Wow, that's so sexy. I always wanted to have sex with a girl named my name." He continued to stare at me and started rambling without pause, clearly expecting reactions from me. "Do you have a boyfriend?" "Yes." "What a shame. I wanted you for myself. But I don't mind, you know. Let's go somewhere else. Come on, change the address in the app, 'cause I can't. Only you can. I know a place where we can go be alone and do some fun stuff." At this point, I started to pay closer attention to the route he was taking. I was almost ready to jump out of the car. The situation was getting pretty sketchy. "Are you going home alone? I could call it a night and go to your place, show you the kind of things I'm talking about." My heart was racing at this point. I actually did live alone. I decided to start recording him from here on, and couldn't think of anything else but to send the recording to my ex. "No, my parents are waiting for me." "Aw, man, what the fuck? We can stay in the car though, I guess. Find a spot where it's dark." "No, I need to go home. I'm tired." "Come on, trust me. Where did I put that weed?" He started searching for something. My ex listened to this part and called me. I was so relieved when I saw my phone ringing. I answered and made sure the driver would hear I was on the phone with someone. He seemed to be very upset about my unexpected phone call, and now he had started talking to himself. My ex was furious, of course, but told me to say things out loud like where I was, when I would get home, other stuff like my mom was waiting for me. I ended the phone call and the driver asked me if that was my boyfriend. I said that it was, and he was silent for about 5 minutes. When he saw on the map that we were getting close to my address, he started asking me again to go somewhere or stay in the car with him. His speech was getting scarier, and he was getting more and more anxious that he couldn't convince me. He was turning around to fully look at me whenever the lights stopped. After what seemed like forever, we got in front of my building. I leapt out of the car and ran away. He called out that he wanted to come with me, but I entered the building and shut it behind me. I didn't turn on the light in the staircase because I didn't want him to see the block I lived in. I stood there in the darkness and peeked out the window just to see if he was gone, but he wasn't. I could see he was clearly observing the entire property, waiting to see exactly which light would turn on, aka where I lived. I couldn't even enter my apartment because I had left the lights on in my hallway, and he would see that light shining through. I waited about 30 minutes before he finally left. I quickly entered my apartment and locked everything, but I didn't turn on or off any lights so it wouldn't seem like it was my home. I peeked out my window just to make sure he'd indeed left, but to my surprise he had suddenly reappeared, parked this time right next to the apartments. I was scared. I was scared out of my mind. I know that many would say I should have called the police at this point, but in my country, the police don't come for stuff like this. They barely show up in an hour if someone's getting beaten to death. He was just sitting there. Then I got a message from an unknown number telling me to come back down because he was waiting for me. I froze and cried. It was like my life was about to completely change just because of a 30 to 40 minute ride with an unstable person. I didn't even know how he'd gotten my number. From the Uber app? Did he buzz me when he arrived to pick me up? I couldn't even remember anymore. I didn't reply. He kept on sending me more messages. I remember one in particular that really creeped me out. He was asking me to at least come down and smoke with him, and I could hear his raspy breaths in smoking. He started calling me as well at some point, and eventually I blocked the number. I was afraid he would get angry and try to sneak into the building to find me. I was looking out the window from behind a curtain. I saw that after I blocked him, he kept on trying to call but couldn't. He started to smash his phone against the steering wheel, and finally, after 40 minutes, he left. I remained keeping watch for another 2 hours or so. Thankfully, he did not return another time. The next day, though, he did message and call from another number, but I blocked that one as well. He kept on trying for an entire year. I was extremely surprised he was so vigilant about it. I blocked all those numbers, and eventually I never heard from him again. I also never saw him in person or his car either. I reported everything to the Uber app, and I hope they took some measures. Honestly, I don't understand why nobody before me reported him. Unfortunately, living in London, I've been attacked a few times, but this was by far the scariest, and also the first. I was 8 years old at the time, visiting my grandparents who lived in London. At the time, I didn't live there yet, and I was just visiting for the summer. I was on a day outing with my parents and our visiting American friend. Let's call her Laura. My dad grew up in this area, so he wanted to take us sightseeing. We had done the Tower of London, Trafalgar Square. We were wandering through the Oxford Street area, just window shopping. I remember I was trailing slightly behind my parents for just a moment, looking into a busy cafe as I walked. It had a counter bar where 2 large ladies were perched on pedestals eating some ice cream. All of a sudden, I remember watching these 2 ladies fall to the side off their chairs onto the floor, almost as if in slow motion. It was like a dream sequence. I even recall the music from the cafe sounding like it was underwater and slowed down momentarily. Except they weren't falling to the floor. Actually, it was me. All I remember next is a huge shooting pain coming from my back and Laura screaming over me. I watched my mom sprinting away through the busy forming crowd full of shocked faces, staring down at me with concern. My dad was on his phone. I remember being angry somewhat because mobile phones were new at the time, and he was always on his, talking to work stuff. I later found out that actually he was calling the police. It took me a moment to figure out what actually happened to me. Well, I thought those big ladies were falling off their chairs. Actually, a homeless man in a heavy coat had suddenly come out of the crowd, picked me up by my collar, and slammed my head down into the pavement. My mom had immediately run after him, chasing him down a busy London street until he pulled a knife on her. Somehow, she and 3 men who were following managed to disarm the man and hold him down until the police arrived. It took around 2 minutes. In the moment it happened, I had no recollection of being attacked. I was excited to ride in an ambulance actually and a police car, and to get the experience of going down to the station. I asked to see a cell, and even remember getting a pen by a police officer. I was in a lot of pain, but I couldn't understand why the paramedic was fussing over me so much. Boy, when the adrenaline wore off, it sure did hurt quite a lot. It's amazing how a child's mind works when it's trying to protect you. As a side note, I did wake up screaming for months every night after, saying the man had snuck into my room, according to my mom at least. I only remember that happening once. In fact, I had a cracked rib, giant black bruises all over my chest, and bruises all over my back from the viciousness of the attack. Later in life, I remember his face quite clearly. It's almost amazing that I didn't remember in the moment just how high he'd picked me up to slam me down. The memory was triggered by receiving birthday bumps as a teen, and it all came rushing back in the most bizarre way. I later found out that the man had in fact been using that large knife for a long time to murder other homeless people at night, and had attacked a few little girls in public as well. He'd always gotten away, though. The police had been looking for him for months. It just so happened the dude hadn't counted on my mom being so fearless. He was put away that very same day, and I had to go to therapy for a few years to figure out just what went on. When I was in college from the ages of 16 to 20, I came into contact with a tutor at my college. His name was Jonathan, and he taught biology at my school. At first, he treated me rather normally, but as time went by, I started to notice things about him that would unsettle me. It started when I'd be sitting in class working or whatever. I'd look up to see him just staring across the room at me from his desk. If I looked at him, he wouldn't look away right away. I'd look away first, then back, and he'd be looking at something else. It used to make me feel uncomfortable, so bad I would purposely go for help with assignments to other tutors. Another thing he would do was constantly mark my assignments and leave the message, "Come find me." He would always do this under the simplest mistakes, even a missing comma, rather than just writing what I needed to add to the assignment. This forced me into interacting with him. He'd always turn the topic of conversation into something else. When I mentioned it to my only friend, she told me he was just being friendly, but I always felt so intimidated by this friendliness. She began to joke I must have had the hots for him, so I stopped telling other people what was happening. When I used to sit on the grass near the campus lake, I would use that time to play my Nintendo Switch. One time when I was playing, I felt a presence at my back and snapped around, only to see him sitting at a picnic table alone staring at me. I felt unsettled by this too, of course. I got up to leave. He shouted at me and said we needed to talk about some assignment. I asked him how long he'd been sitting there. He told me he'd just gone outside to think moments ago and hadn't realized he was looking at me. He went on talking about how our assignment was worth extra marks or something. He told me he noticed I didn't seem to have many friends and asked if I had a girlfriend. I lied and said yes, then said I needed to leave. After that, it was very obvious to me that he was watching me, but I found him very creepy and didn't know who to tell. I made a Reddit post and people said I was probably making something out of nothing, blamed my anxiety and told me to get therapy. I tried to just dismiss it as me being paranoid. Whenever I was at college, though, I would see him everywhere. I'd look over in the library only to see him watching me. Outside, in the courtyard, I'd see him following me behind a building. It made college into a nightmare for 4 years straight, and I had nobody I felt like I could talk about it with. I remember one situation where he taught a lesson about how livestock animals are artificially inseminated. Without going into graphic detail, he started talking about milking them for their seed with a gloved hand. Nothing out of the ordinary for that type of class. We were given assignments like that as part of our course anyway. Jonathan, though, said he had marked my assignment for something and I had to wait for it at the end of the lesson. When everyone else had left the room, I went up to his desk to grab it. When he handed it over to me, I noticed he was wearing a single glove on one hand and gave me an eerie smile. I got creeped out and left. Didn't ask anything, just left the room. I was worried nobody would believe me about how weird he was being. When I graduated college, he sent my whole class friend requests on Facebook. I didn't accept, of course, but for a long time he continued to just delete and resend the request all the way up till I blocked him. At one point, I got a random text from an unknown number saying we needed to talk, and he had uncontrollable feelings for me. I knew who this was, of course, and blocked the number right away. He was so obsessed with me, he bought a house on the same street as me and bought a dog so he could walk it and run into me whenever I walked my own. He tried to make it look like an innocent coincidence, but I knew he'd been doing this just to get close to me. To avoid him, I started going on late-night walks at 2 a.m., thinking I would be safe because he'd be asleep, only for him to approach me in the street out of the darkness. I told him to leave me alone and called him a stalker. He apologized for the way he'd been acting and begged for a second chance. I'd never even given him a first one, though. I went home, and I became certain he might try to kill me. And that's when I told my parents, who contacted the police. They couldn't do anything about it, though, because I had no evidence of any of these situations taking place. It was at least on record now. My parents started paying towards rent, so I could live in a different area to feel safer. Well, wouldn't you know, as soon as I left to rent in a different city, he sold the house he'd bought and bought a new one in my exact same city. I then moved and started renting somewhere else, and he was stuck with this house he'd bought this time. Even to this day, I feel like I have to keep looking over my shoulder. I'm not a very tall guy. I'm only 5 feet. He's over 6.5 feet tall. He's very intimidating, and every time I see him, chills run down my spine. I'm too scared to even have an online dating account anymore. I'm planning to move country soon, so I can be rid of him once and for all. I won't say where I'm moving just in case he finds this. I doubt he would, but better safe than sorry. This happened 5 to 6 years ago. After meeting up with a couple of friends who were stationed near the bar, my friend Robin and I decided to end our girls' night early, at around 1 a.m. or so. I'm horrible with street names, so bear with me. We went to Rocket Bar that night, so you can know it was near there if you know that place. We hopped in a car and started pulling out. We were driving a bit slow because we weren't very familiar with the area, and we didn't want to get lost or miss any turns late at night. I had my window rolled down a bit, because when I drink, I can get a bit flushed. The street we were on was completely dead at this moment. We heard a yell out of nowhere, and some loud-ass crying as well. It was clearly a woman's voice, so we slowed the car down to try and see what was going on. Robin was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. On our right side, we saw a lady stumble out onto the street, holding her chest and sobbing. Robin locked the doors and cautiously rolled my window back up, leaving only an inch or so open. The lady stumbled right up to my window and said, "I need help." I asked her what was wrong. She just kept on repeating she needed us to help her over and over. Me, being a naive idiot, I put my hand on the door like I was about to open it, only to be grabbed firmly by Robin. She whispered in my ear, "Don't you dare fucking open that door." The woman kept on mumbling "I need help" repeatedly, like she was slurring her words together. As soon as she saw Robin stop me though, her eyes opened wide as hell, and she started screaming. We jumped up and said, "What's wrong? What do you need?" At this point, she shoved her fingers through the cracked part of the window and screamed to let her in. We started yelling at her to go away. The lady started yanking at my door handle. Robin said hell no, and we started to pull away. The next 30 seconds was the most terrifying part. All of a sudden, the lady called out into the night, "They're leaving!" We saw a bunch of people run out from a car parked a few cars behind us on the right. Robin sped away like a scene from an action movie. We looked into the rearview mirror and saw there were 4 people standing in the street now. Ladies and gentlemen, please be careful. I can't imagine what would have happened to my dumb ass if it weren't for my friend. I know it's in some of us to want to help, but there are a lot of evil people out there who disguise themselves to do us harm. Be aware of your surroundings and lock your doors in DC. When I was 15, I traveled with 2 friends who were both 15 as well. We took the train to get to an event a few hours away from where we lived. We were all interested in working in healthcare, and went to a what it's like to work in this field event in another city. After the event ended, we didn't have long to get to the train station to catch our train home. We had pre-booked for a taxi from the venue straight to the station because of this. This was before the days of Uber, mind you. When the event ended in the evening, finishing slightly late, we rushed out to find our taxi, who must have been waiting for us. We approached one that appeared to be waiting for someone specifically. We had seen the driver turning away other people for a while. I called out to him, "Excuse me, is this the taxi for my name to the train station?" The taxi driver said yes. So we all quickly jumped into his car. After 10 minutes of driving though, my friend got a call from the taxi company saying our pre-booked taxi was back at the venue, still waiting for us. We realized this was not our taxi. I asked the driver to turn around, only for him to glare at me. No, I'm not going to do that. He locked the doors right there and then. We started protesting, telling him to stop, that he wasn't our driver. He had lied to us that it was our taxi. Of course, he refused. My friend panicked and started hyperventilating. We thought he was going to kill us. Maybe that was an overreaction, but we were young and far from home in a dangerous situation. He started screaming at us that he wasn't going to let us out. We were in his car now. Eventually, I threatened to call the police, at which point he braked sharply and told us to get out right now. He left us on the side of the road and sped off at 90 miles per hour. The road was completely deserted. It was a dark winter evening, and we were all pretty freaked out now. My friend called the booked taxi, and thankfully they picked us up and took us to the station anyway. We didn't manage to get the fake taxi's number plate or any information from the car. In retrospect, I don't know if he really meant us harm. Perhaps he just wanted to scalp the journey and get paid instead. But we were 3 young 15-year-old girls far from home. He really panicked us by behaving so aggressively and locking the doors. Now in my mid-20s, I always carefully check the number plate on the Uber app to make sure it's the right car. There's this hotel by the Bulgarian seaside, in which we have an apartment. To be honest, that's a very strong word for it. It's basically just a big room with a giant bed, refrigerator, and big windows on both of the walls. I guess it also has a small bathroom as well. It's on the ground floor, and again, both of the walls are facing the parking lot of the hotel. Despite all of this though, it's perfect for me alone. It's situated right next to the beach, and that's why I've been spending some of my summer vacations there recently. So, July 3 years ago, I'm spending a week with my ex-boyfriend there, and 3 to 4 weeks alone by myself after that. My ex always said that the owners of the hotel were a bunch of creeps. Whenever we went out of the room, he had to walk a path passing through the reception, where they used to sit all day doing nothing. The old dad in his 60s, I guess, his son Crumb, who was about 40, and his daughter, who was 45. Her husband would also sometimes join them. When you'd pass by, they'd just all get silent immediately and stare at you. Every single time. I was used to this behavior after a while, but the boyfriend was very irritated, especially when he caught Crumb staring at my ass and smiling. After that, he used to stare him down deadly, right in the eyes whenever he got the chance. Soon, my ex went back to the city. It was now the 3rd week I'd been alone. The night was extremely hot, so I opened both windows wide open and put the curtains above them to defend myself from being peeked at. After all, I was at the ground level and my bed was right below both of the windows. I woke up in the middle of the night and suddenly felt like someone was watching me. This happened for the next few nights as well. I'm easily scared and paranoid, but I was alone there, so I had been telling myself to chill out. It must just be my crazy mind trying to scare itself. Some nights went by without problem. Meanwhile, Crumb tried to talk to me 2 to 3 times when I was off to the beach. It was around 1 a.m. now. I was falling asleep when I began to hear footsteps outside the path. It was not exactly strange. There were some people staying next to me at the same kind of apartment. Maybe someone was coming home or going out partying late at night. Then, though, the steps stopped really close by outside. I could hear all of this because of the opened windows. I was sitting in the bed now and listening when I noticed that the door handle was moving slowly up and down. I lost my shit but stayed quiet. I silently thanked myself for remembering to lock the door before I'd gone to bed. After a while of silently jimmying the handle, nothing happened and the person walked away. I closed the windows after that. I called my dad and told him what just happened. He told me to lock and close everything, and he'd come grab me in the morning. It's a 5-hour drive. This was 3 years ago. Last night we were having dinner together, and my dad said, "Hey, do you remember your sea adventures?" He proceeded to tell me he had made his own little investigation back in the day and asked the owners of the hotel for security camera records. They checked the ones in the parking lot and saw a male figure skulking around. The part with the door handle was not in the camera range, unfortunately. My dad remembers my strange midnight waking up routine and told them to check the older records as well. In each of them, they saw a man peeking through my windows, trying to grab through the curtains, standing like that for 15 to 20 minutes each time. The woman finally recognized her brother and told my dad he had mental disabilities. She begged him not to press any charges and that they'd promise to take better care of him and look after him from then on. My dad, being a good guy, did not press charges. It appears that now we're selling the apartment. So, anyone interested in buying, perhaps? I was 19 years old, and the only female working at a shop specializing in automotive batteries and things of that nature. I had been working there long enough to realize that most of the clientele was male, and oftentimes that made for some awkward situations. For instance, I would get talked down to and patronized quite a bit, or flirted with to the point where I would be somewhat uncomfortable. I have a really thick skin though, thankfully, so most of the time I typically wasn't very bothered. One day, during a particularly busy rush, a very tall and well-built man, who was maybe in his mid-30s, came in through my line. I consider myself to be pretty good at reading people, and this guy was giving off some very, very strange vibes. Something about him seemed a little bit off. However, it was my job to be professional and assist whoever came through my line regardless, so I brushed aside those uneasy feelings. I just wanted to ring this guy out and get through the rest of the line that was now trailing out the front door. I greeted and talked to him as I would any other customer while I was processing his transaction. Things were going pretty fine actually, until he realized I was almost done. He started stalling and making up weird excuses as to why he couldn't use certain credit cards. Now he needed me to put his battery on hold. He would come back later, etc. I told him I would hold it for him and he could come back whenever he found the time in the future. I figured he would just leave at that point, but instead he stood there and stared at me. Now that I think about it, it was more like he was staring through me rather than at me. I was a bit uneasy, but I kept my polite and professional demeanor. Sir, if you're not purchasing anything at the moment, may I ask you to please step aside so that I can assist all these other customers? He completely disregarded my question though, and in a slow, raspy voice, he asked, "So, what's your name?" I didn't wear a name tag specifically for reasons like this. Customers had found me on Facebook before in the past, and it was quite unsettling. Thinking quickly, I threw out my nickname instead. "It's Rhea." "Rhea," he said, as he kept on staring through me. I smiled awkwardly. "Yep, that's me." By this point, my manager had realized what was going on and proceeded to ask the man to step aside as well. After hearing it from my manager, the man walked to a corner of the store by some shelving and continued to stare while I wrung the rest of the customers out. A bit of time went by, and the line had since cleared up, but he was still standing there, staring and now smiling the most sickening smile I think I've ever seen. It made my skin crawl. Of course, my manager and coworker saw this as well. My coworker grabbed my arm and said, "Come on, dude, let's go to the back instead." As we were walking into the stock room, my manager walked over to ask the man if there was anything else he needed. The man muttered that there wasn't and left. I wish that was the end of it, but of course he had to come back in to purchase the battery. When he came back the next day, we again had a long line. He even let people go ahead of him and waited until I was completely free before coming up to the counter to make his purchase. I greeted him again and tried my best to remain professional, but it was hard considering how creeped out by this guy I was. I was met again with that same vacant stare and that freaky fucking smile. I can't remember exactly the entire conversation, but at some point the questions he was asking became weird and inappropriate enough for my coworker to cut in on my behalf. He looked at the guy, then over at me. "Hey Rhea, why don't you go take your break instead?" He basically pushed me out of the way and rang the guy out instead of me. I stayed in the back until my manager came and got me, telling me it was safe to come out. We were all pretty weirded out by this, but of course that would be the end of it, right? A few days went by. We had all mostly forgotten about this creepy dude, until he walked in again. This time though, he didn't even look through the store. He didn't approach the counter. He didn't say a single word to anyone. He just stood in the back, pulled his hood up over his head, and hid in the very corner of the store, staring at me and smiling. His smile had become even wider and more sinister looking. At this point, I really started to freak out. I started shaking and feeling sick to my stomach. My manager came and screamed at the guy. "Hey you, I'm sick of you coming into my store and pulling this crap. If you're not gonna buy anything, get out." The creep paid him no mind though. He kept on staring at me. This of course pissed my manager off. He walked out from around the corner and told the dude, "Look man, if you don't quit coming in here and staring, I will not hesitate to call the cops. What you're doing is harassment, so get the hell out of my store." At the mention of the police, this dude's smile turned into a snarl, and he slowly sauntered out of the store. We never saw him again after that, but I was immediately taken off closing shifts due to the fear that the man would come back and try to catch me when I was there alone. I've definitely dealt with my fair share of creeps at that job, but this guy was by far the most disturbing. At about 8 p.m. last night, yeah, what a spooky time, I was walking with a friend of mine, Sally, about a mile to the closest cafe. We're both girls in our early 20s. Neither of us own cars, and Sally didn't have her Opal card, which is the Aussie version of an Oyster card, basically an automatic ticketing system for public transport. This meant that walking was our only option. It's summer over here right now, so it was still fairly well lit. We were walking down main roads as well, so we weren't too concerned for our safety. We finally arrived at this cafe and sat down together. I was paying, but I only had my credit card with me. Sure enough, the restaurant was cash only. Sally was on the phone when I got back from the counter, so I gestured for her to stay put and guard the spot while I went to go grab some cash. This was my home suburb, so I know there's no ATMs around. My best bet was a gas station about a block away. I'm doing a light jog so I wouldn't keep Sally waiting, when a balding, sweating man, probably in his late 40s, with a tank top and no shoes, came running behind me as I passed the corner of the block. He began walking behind me for about 100 meters. I really didn't think too much of it at first. The gas station was the next building along, and it seemed like he had just come out of a very nice suburban house along the street. It wasn't the witching hour yet either, so I just assumed he was in a hurry to get to the gas station like I was. He didn't even cross my mind as I entered the tiny convenience store, nor did he attempt to follow me in. In my peripheral vision, I could see him walk right past the door and out of sight. I began to look around for an ATM that they sometimes have inside. No such luck, unfortunately. I went up to this man in his 30s behind the desk and reluctantly asked if they were able to do cash out. He smiled politely at me. Of course. Is that man with you, by the way? I have no idea who he's talking about at first. He pointed to the man from earlier, though, who was now pacing around outside the store. Keep in mind, he didn't look at all menacing. He wasn't just going back and forth right outside the door or anything. He was drifting in the space outside, from the pavement to the gas pumps to the storefront, seemingly aimlessly. I assumed he must be on drugs or something. I told the clerk no, not thinking very much of it at all. Oh, well, he was really staring at you before, you know. I thought he might have been your dad or something. I laughed it off. Honestly, I was not too concerned. He was just ambling around outside. I couldn't imagine him having a fixed gaze on anything. I thanked the clerk for the cash, but before I turned away to leave, he said, "Why don't you just wait here for a second? Let's see if he leaves first." We waited there for a few minutes together in silence, as the guy began to pace back and forth directly against the front wall of the store, looking straight ahead and never inside. It still looked like the man was just on a drug-induced shamble and seemed harmless. Not once did he seem to even attempt to look at me, so I figured it would be safe to just slip out the door and walk back to the cafe in the fairly bright light of dusk, especially since Sally was texting me at this point, rushing me to come back. I thanked the guy at the desk once again for his concern, and assured him that I did not know the guy and was not involved in some weird scheme to rob the store or something. As I started to head for the door, the clerk called out and asked if I wanted him to walk out with me. I said I should be alright, and began walking away from the block. As I left the store, though, the drifting man stopped pacing immediately and began to make a beeline for me from the other end of the building. I seriously hadn't given a single thought to this guy at all up until this point, but for the first time he was now heading in a straight line toward me. The hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood straight up. I started power walking so he wouldn't think I was actively trying to escape him, still trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid and should be more casual instead. I didn't look behind me to see how close he was. I'd reached the pavement on the other side of the gas pumps when I heard the store clerk sprint outside. "Go! Run!" I made a break for it, looking over my shoulder. He'd grabbed the man by his arms from behind. The balding man was not even glancing at the attendant or trying to escape. He just stood there watching me run away. That's pretty much the end of the story, folks. I kept running until I crossed the road, then turned around and stood still. The cashier was now holding firmly onto the odd, staring man. We shared a brief glance in bewilderment, not really knowing what to do. He made a hand gesture to go. I gestured my thanks and ran away. I got back to Sally with the cash and bought the food, before walking back home a different way. To set the tone for this, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college, and very quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town, but full of not-so-decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently. There were shootings all the time in broad daylight. Robberies, kidnappings, you name it. For the first 3 years, I lived with roommates on a side of town that wasn't particularly awful. It was just a bit sketchy. How lucky. When I was making decent enough money, I decided to move out on my own. The house was tiny, maybe 500 square feet if that. It was super old and poorly built as well. I was the only person living there, so I didn't really mind how small it was. What originally sold me, though, was that it was right in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields and wooded areas, with only a scant few houses nearby. Considering I despised being in the town itself due to the continuous paranoia of being mugged or shot for no reason, I loved the idea of living where nobody was out there. At the beginning of July, I moved in. Everything seemed super swell, minus not being able to get good internet. A month went by and everything was still super good for me. I decided to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place and spent large amounts of time lounging about the yard and trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. This is in fact a detail that will be important later. After about 2 months of living there though, I started to notice things were out of place sometimes. Something to note is that an old roommate of mine was using my spare room as a storage space until he got moved himself. So he had a key to move his stuff there but never really came by. He kinda popped in once every other week or so to maybe grab something from storage and usually let me know beforehand. Now though, I'd come home to my kitchen chair being obviously pulled away from my table, or a new bowl in the sink, things like that. They were such small, innocuous things, at first I wrote it off as my roommate swinging by, or perhaps something I'd forgotten because I was really tired. Then though, my dog started to develop this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't even care when I left. He'd just lay on the couch and chew his toys all day. He never barked, never did anything weird. All of a sudden though, he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He'd literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and would not stop until I came back inside with him. He didn't want me to leave him there alone at all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him, so I decided one day I'd put a movie in while I was out, thinking maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calmed down. I only had to finish one task at work, and I knew I'd be home early that day, so I popped in a copy of Hamlet. I know, it's pretty boring, but I chose it because the copy I have is 5 hours long. I knew it would still be playing when I came back. Flash forward 3 hours though. Long before that copy of Hamlet should have been over. When I walked through the door, not only was the movie not playing, but the TV and all the appliances were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over. He wasn't even in town at the time. I explained the TV situation to him. He shrugged it off as the TV powering off when it idled for a while. Even though this could be true, there were several reasons I knew this wasn't the case. 1, it was not idling, a 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. And 2, even if it shut off by itself, my Xbox that was playing it wouldn't have turned off too. I had once left it on by accident for weeks while I was out of town or whatever, and it was still on when I came home, always, but everything was completely powered down this time. The weird thing was though, none of my stuff was missing. The door was even fully locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself perhaps it was a weird shortage with the Xbox or whatever, and shrugged it off. That is, until my dog started acting even weirder. Remember earlier when I mentioned he used to play with the neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she walked by the house while he was out, he'd start screaming and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird to me, and made me suspicious of her as well. I put some cheap alarms on all my doors, the kind that go off when they're opened, and slept with my pistol handy. The second night the alarms were on my doors, I was woken up by the one on the back door going off. I flew out of bed with my pistol, trying to convince myself that I was about to shoot some intruder. Once I got there, it was shut though, and there was nobody around. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room though. The door would have had to been opened really hard for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and just landed there. The weirdest thing was though, the door was still locked, but not the way I had locked it. I always locked the knob and the deadbolt, but upon checking my lock after this, only the doorknob was locked. The police wouldn't do very much, as I had no witnesses, no leads, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed the lock shortly thereafter. I didn't have any noticeable problems inside after that, but I later found out my close neighbor that my dog now hated had previously lived in the house I was renting. The locks had never been changed. I have no way to really prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. The why though, I really can't figure out. None of my stuff ever went missing, not even the money. The most unsettling part for me, though, is that she tried to come in at night until the alarm scared her off. How many times had she come into my house at night while I was asleep? And why had she done so? So, a few days ago, I got back from a family holiday in the countryside on a really nice property. I'm not sure if it was through Airbnb or some other similar company, but imagine that kind of thing. A fully furnished house with more or less all amenities provided. I have a fairly wide, extended family, some of whom would be staying with us, some of whom wouldn't be, and some of whom would only be staying for a few nights before leaving early. My parents and I would be staying all week though, and we were the very first to arrive at the house. As I said before, it was a very good-looking property, not surrounded by other houses, but not completely isolated either. Because we were the first to arrive, we basically got first picks on rooms, and were able to unpack and explore the whole place before everyone else even arrived. I got my own room on the first floor. For reference, I'm 18 years old. There's one room on the top floor with a bathroom attached. Going up there, the first thing that struck me was just how hot it was in there. There were windows through which the sun was shining in, which I thought might be the source of this heat, so I shut all the blinds, but it didn't really get any cooler. Aside from the bathroom, there was another door in this room, but it was locked from the other side. It goes without saying that this was kind of weird, not the least because I had no idea what could possibly be on the other side of that door. There was a locked door downstairs too, but that one had an obvious keyhole and was very clearly a boiler room due to the sounds I could hear on the other side. But with this room, I just really had no idea what it could possibly be. There was also a small crawlspace door upstairs. It didn't have a lock or handle or anything like that, but I couldn't figure out how to open it. I'm not sure how relevant that crawlspace really was to all of this, but I thought I'd at least mention it as somewhat suspicious. Anyway, after a few hours, other family members arrived, including my grandparents who, being the oldest in the family, and so the most respected, got to choose a room as well and chose upstairs. Despite the fact that my grandparents are both in their 70s, they're both extremely fit, not just for their age, but for anybody really. They keep very active, and they don't get scared very easily at all. I couldn't say I really envied them taking that top room though. I'll skip most of the other details about the holiday since they aren't really relevant to the story itself, and fast forward to the first night. The property had this large garden, like really big. People at one end would have to scream for someone at the other end to even hear them. What made the property even nicer to me was there was a large hot tub out back by that garden. On the first evening, 11 p.m., I was in the hot tub by myself. Most of the other people had already gone to sleep. Having all the lights out and just sitting in the bubbling water, the only sounds audible to me were the buzzing of the jets and the chirping of the crickets. It was quite the serene experience. Just barely over the sound of the water, though, I could have sworn I heard something moving down on the other end of the garden. There was no way I could be sure of that, though, since it was so far away. I turned on the lights in the tub to as high as they could go, but obviously that didn't provide me with very much in the way of visibility. Looking back, it was actually probably a pretty stupid move because it made me more visible. I still couldn't see to the end of the garden, but now I kinda had the creeps. I realized just how exposed I felt, and decided to wrap up and head to bed. My room had these big glass doors that faced out into the back garden, which also made me kind of uneasy. I'd be lying though if I told you I heard any scratches on my window or something cliche like that. I actually didn't hear anything else and went to sleep perfectly fine. The next morning at breakfast though, I was talking with my grandma, who sorta dropped a bombshell on me. She told me that last night she had noticed a light turn on then off in the locked room upstairs. Not that I said anything, but this really freaked me out. I know the idea of someone secretly living in the house with us sounds dumb, and that's not really where my mind was going. Truth be told, I wasn't sure what to think. So that night I got totally drunk, like really hammered. I'm a bit of a lightweight and obviously not an experienced drinker, so it really didn't take much for me to get to that point. Regardless, I'm not exactly proud of the state I was in. I went out to the hot tub again, this time with my cousin who was a bit older than me, not even aware of my surroundings. The heat of the water combined with the effects of the alcohol made my brain basically turn into mush. I couldn't think clearly, and that's by my own admission. We were just listening to music and sort of chilling, when she suddenly pointed over at the other end of the garden to get my attention. "Hey, do you see that?" she asked. The garden had these automatic lights along one side, so if there was any movement they would turn on, illuminating one half of the lawn. From what I had seen 2 of them, they weren't super sensitive, so you would have to get really close. I peered over the side of the tub but couldn't see anything in the dark. That's when my cousin had the bright idea to reach over the side and throw a football onto the garden. The sound it made as it thudded onto the grass still makes me feel sick. The lights flashed on, revealing a dark figure scurrying behind the fence at the back of the yard and just out of sight. We should have probably gotten out of the tub and went to bed at that point, or in reality called the cops, but for some dumb reason, we decided to go and investigate ourselves. She was a few drinks in too, I'll note. Not as much as me, and she keeps it down much better, but we both had some liquid courage going, if you know what I mean. Once we got there, it was too dark to see much, but the fence was very clearly broken to the point where someone could easily squeeze through the gap in it and make their way onto the road adjacent to the property. That alone is creepy enough, but what really freaks me out is what happened the next day. For a little bit of context, I'm in the build-up to some really important exams right now, and just because I was on holiday didn't mean I would be cutting myself any slack in studying. Because of this, when my whole family went out that day, I stayed home to work. In my room, there was this rubber door stopper thing propping my door open, and a spare one in the drawers as well. I left the one propping the door open next to it, in case I wanted to keep the door open, or more realistically, keep it shut. Bear in mind that particular door did not have a lock on it. I kept the second one hidden under my bed in a really specific place you would never find unless you were deliberately looking for it, tucked away in the bed frame basically. The door doesn't close by itself, but if there's a draft, it will eventually slam shut after some time. At some point, I got very bored of studying and decided to go make myself a drink and get some snacks. What can you do? While in the kitchen, though, I heard this loud thud come from my room. Because of the way the kitchen was positioned, I couldn't actually see my door, though. At first, this understandably freaked me out, but then I heard the front door open. It was just my family. I put it out of my mind and returned to my room, only to see that the rubber door stopper was balanced on the door frame, just flush against the wall. I assumed it must have been someone in my family. I walked back in, only to see that the other stopper was still next to the door. I questioned my family at dinner. They all swore up and down they hadn't moved a single thing. This created some quite nasty implications, mainly that I had been home alone with someone, or perhaps something. I'm not sure which is scarier, really. Luckily, nothing else of this nature happened during my trip, and needless to say, I was grateful just to get home. This remains the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. I haven't told my cousin about the incident, since I figure I'd probably just sound crazy. I can only speculate too as to whether or not this was related to the incident from the night before. I'd like to think they're not, but I'm fairly certain about what I saw. My only advice to anyone using Airbnb or similar services is to thoroughly research the area you'll be staying in and make absolutely sure the property is secure. This is a real story, but some of you might probably not believe me. I usually don't even talk about this because of the trauma and the fact that people look at me like I'm crazy when I tell them about it. This was on the news too, but out of privacy and respect, I won't share the articles or the news clips here. Anyways, this story is about my intuition and my friend's at times strange older brother. I'll call him Corey and I'll call her Kara. I always used to play over at her house all the time, considering her mom and my mom were the best of friends. Back then, the whole neighborhood was basically a playground, and it honestly felt so much bigger as a child. The world can be a scary place, but I always had common sense, and that kept me in one piece, considering I was very accident-prone. Anyways, I'd play a lot at Kara's house, but I always had the weirdest feeling around her brother Corey. It felt like he was constantly watching me, and it made me very uncomfortable. He seemed to be popular, and everyone always hung out around him, but every time I was around him, I just felt very sick. He would do these things like kick small animals and make them yelp. He was very aggressive when he played with us too. One time he held my head underwater when we went swimming, and another time he watched me change in the bathroom. I noticed him after I got dressed, and saw the door cracked open. I didn't see him, but I felt his presence there. Sometimes it even felt like his own mom was scared of him. One day I went over to Kara's house when I was in middle school. The door was unlocked, so I just walked right in. I thought they were home because I smelled spaghetti cooking, and I loved Kara's mom's cooking. I turned around. There was Corey acting just like normal. Nothing rang a bell at first. I asked him where Kara and her mom were. He said they had just gone to the store. He said I could go into Kara's room and wait for her to get back. I almost did, but I felt him looming behind me as I was about to go into her room. This was normal, just like every other time, but for some reason I got terrified out of nowhere. It felt like I was suffocating, and my throat started to hurt, and tears started to form in my eyes. I turned around and looked at him, and all of a sudden I just started begging him to let me go with tears pouring from my eyes. We stood there for 5 minutes in suffocating silence, and then he just said I could go. I faced him as I slowly backed up toward the door and ran all the way back home. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he had already killed himself. Kara was found dead in her bed, and her mom was found dead in hers as well. He had stabbed them both to death. To this day, I still don't know why he let me go and didn't kill me too. I worked at a Jimmy John's restaurant for a couple of years when I was at college. It was a nice place to work, plus I had a car, so I easily got hired as a delivery driver. There's something about doing the majority of the work in your car that makes the job so much more enjoyable. Plus, I could take my study notes and play them in the car while I drove around. Early on during my sophomore year of college, I began delivering to a man who lived in Verona. He was right on the edge of our delivery area and was a nice older man, likely in his early 70s. The first time I delivered to him, he seemed quite taken with me. I could tell. After that first delivery, he began to ask on the phone whenever he placed an order, specifically for me. I know that most people might think this was creepy right away, but honestly, it didn't really come across that way. He was a very nice older man, seemingly. Never came on to me, didn't even give me the once-over when I was over there. He always gave me a very healthy tip as well. As a Jimmy John's driver, that could be a rare experience. It really didn't matter to me if he liked me or whatever. He was never creepy or weird about it, so it was just fine. At least once a week, he would call in an order, and each time he would ask, "Is Jen working today?" With that, I would go and deliver his sandwich to him. During finals week that year, I decided to go ahead and work anyway. I didn't need to take time off to study because I could always just study in my car anyway. One afternoon, around 2 hours into work, the snow started falling very steadily, and it began to accumulate quickly. We didn't get a whole lot of orders that day because of this, so ironically, I wasn't really getting that much studying done. I did have my books out in the car, so I went to go out and grab them, and got to work as well. At about 9 p.m., the phone rang. I answered it, and before I was even able to give my name, I heard the familiar voice of that old man asking me, "Is Jen working today?" He placed his regular order, and I hopped in my car to drive over to his place. I had to go rather slowly because the snow was so slippery this night. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, so I was used to driving in the snow, but this particular snow was a bit sloppy. I found myself skidding quite a bit. It was piling up fast on my windshield, so I had to keep my wipers on full blast just to remove it. It was very difficult to see where I was going. Fortunately, Jimmy John's only delivers really close to their stores, so I arrived at his house pretty quickly. I parked on the street right behind another car, which appeared to be warming up. I thought that was odd because with the snowstorm in full gear, I didn't think anybody should be out driving tonight unless they really had to. Home was the perfect place to be. I grabbed the old man's order and hopped out of the car. Looking at the house, though, I noticed he had all of his lights off this time, which was rather unusual. I went up and knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again. This time, I heard a voice from inside the house shout out at me, "Come in!" This was different than every other time I delivered there. The man had always come right to the door. He'd never asked me to come inside either. This was really odd. I really didn't want to go into a customer's house, so I knocked on the door again. Again, I heard him yell at me to come in. After considering it for a moment, I finally decided to go inside. The man had always been nice to me before, and I had no reason to expect this time would be any different. I found it pretty unlikely he would have been the type of creep that would spend months trying to gain my trust, just to invite me into his house one random evening and do something to me. That seemed kind of silly to me. I opened the door and walked in. The house was dimly lit by a lamp in the corner. I was in the front hallway. I looked around and peeked into the living room, where I saw the man rocking in his chair right by the fireplace. There was a very small fire going. I couldn't really see much else, other than the man's silhouette. I was really unnerved at this image. I felt like I should just turn around, go back outside, get in my car, and leave. It was then that something caught my eye. On the floor, right next to his chair, I saw a knife laying on the carpet. That was the clincher that convinced me to leave. Just as I decided to do so, I heard the man call out softly, "Jen, don't go." In my head, I was telling myself, screw that, this is way too weird. I had been moving slowly, but I noticed the man was making no attempt to get up and follow me. I turned and rushed toward the door. Just as I was about to reach it, though, I saw through the glass something moving off the side of the door on the porch. My heart jumped in my chest. I realized that somebody was standing just out of view of the door, pressed up against the house. I realized right then why the man hadn't gotten up to follow me. He had an accomplice outside who was going to grab me as soon as I left. It seemed like an eternity passed as I stood there, wondering what to do in this situation. I now had a creep both inside and outside the house. Regardless of what I did, it seemed I would be subject to one of them. The man outside moved. I knew he'd noticed that I was not acting. As he moved toward the door, I quickly reached out and grabbed it. I locked it tight. The man stared at me through the window. He was wearing a black ski mask over his face, but I could see the anger in his eyes. He began to pound on the door, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I took out my cell phone and dialed 911. I showed him the screen as I hit the call button. He got the hint and turned and left. He jumped into the car I'd seen warming up and drove off. It turned out the old man hadn't been trying to hurt me at all. In the time period of about 30 minutes that it had taken since he'd placed his order and the time I got there, someone had broken into his house, beat him up, and tied him to his rocking chair. The intruder was right in the middle of robbing him and had been loading things into his car when he saw me pull up to the house. Apparently, he was going to do something to me on my way back out. Well, even though nobody was hurt in the end and the old man gave me a pretty good tip for helping him, I just couldn't take the stress of that job anymore. I quit after and got a job waiting tables. Much happier experience. This is the weirdest thing that ever happened to me in my entire life. I can't actually explain how it happened either, but I can guarantee it did happen. During a snowstorm one winter, I was hanging out with my then girlfriend. We were having a wonderful evening all in all, and we decided we should watch a movie and order a pizza. I hated the idea of making a pizza delivery guy deliver a pizza in the middle of a snowstorm. My girlfriend, though, insisted they often got very busy when it snowed out, so I broke down and let her order a pizza. We then settled in and I tried to decide what movie to watch. Nearly 45 minutes after we placed the order, my girlfriend began to get very impatient. I tried to tell her that with the driving conditions so poor, combined with that increased business she had told me about, she had to give the poor guy a little bit of leeway as to when he would arrive. She was having none of this, though, and kept on saying bad things about the pizza place. Finally, about an hour after I'd placed the order, I noticed the lights of a car pulling up alongside the house. Outside, I heard someone come up on the porch and begin to knock on the door. I went to the door, opened it, and of course, there was the pizza delivery. He gave me the pizza, which I had already paid for, and I gave him a tip. This was despite the fact my girlfriend insisted he didn't deserve one, since he'd taken so long to get there. She did this right in front of him, mind you. I apologized for her behavior and sent him on his way. I put the pizza box down on the kitchen counter and proceeded to get into a fight with my girlfriend about being so rude and nosy. I placed the pizza box on the kitchen counter and then proceeded to get into a big fight with my girlfriend about being so damn rude. I'd never seen her act that way about something before, but it seemed she had a bug up her ass about pizza delivery guys for whatever reason. I warned her that she had to be careful, or one day when she ordered something she would end up with a spit in her food, if she was lucky. If she was unlucky, it could be something worse. As the two of us stood there arguing, suddenly I heard another knock at the door. Confused as to who could possibly be coming over to the house during the snowstorm, the two of us went to answer it together. Upon opening it, there was the pizza delivery guy standing right there. He apologized for the long wait to get to us. We were surprised. We told him that our pizza had already just been delivered. He was insisting that was impossible, because he was the only driver working that night. He told us that's why it had taken him so long to get there. I didn't know what to do. I had already paid for the thing online, so it didn't seem like a scheme to try and screw us over or anything. The driver seemed genuinely confused and upset as well. My girlfriend began verbally assaulting him. I couldn't understand why she was acting this way. After a moment, I became fed up with it and just took the second pizza anyway. I gave that driver a tip as well, and he left. We walked back into the kitchen, with my girlfriend nagging me about how she had been right about them all along. She told me I shouldn't have tipped that second guy, because clearly he was just conning me. It just didn't make sense. I was getting really fed up with how she was acting. I decided it would be best to just have our pizza and watch the movie. I got myself a plate and proceeded to open both boxes. When I opened the box delivered by the first driver, though, my girlfriend began to scream. I looked inside. There was what looked like the torn-up bodies of animals scattered all over the pizza. On the back of the box in red was written, "Next time," my girlfriend's name. I didn't know what it meant, and I never found out, as we broke up shortly afterward. Considering the way my girlfriend was acting towards the pizza delivery guys, maybe she'd pissed off somebody pretty badly in the past. Weird thing is, I have no idea how the first guy even knew we'd ordered a pizza. Whatever it was, and whatever conflict my girlfriend had with the pizza delivery people, I'm glad I never had to experience anything more. I'm the son of two first-generation immigrants from China. My parents came over during the 1960s, after the immigration quota was raised for the 1965 Immigration Act. They settled down in Chicago, and I was their first child born in the United States. I grew up in the 70s and early to mid-80s. My parents opened up a restaurant in the 70s that I still own today. Although I currently enjoy a lot of success, that was not always the case. In fact, in the early days, the restaurant didn't make much money at all. To keep from hiring too much outside help and increasing costs, all the family had to pitch in to help. I'm sure you've seen this happen at some smaller Chinese restaurants. I would come to the store after school and sit in the booth by the cash register and do my homework while helping. If the phone rang, I would be the one taking the orders. When the customers came to pick up their food, I would hand them the food and take their money. I didn't get paid for this work, but it was really minimal effort, and it didn't really interrupt my studying very much either. When I was 16 years old, enough to legally drive and work, my parents hired me as a delivery driver. I was happy to finally be making some money. Basically, I only worked for tips, but it was a decent amount of money all the same. More often than not after that, my younger sisters and brothers took over the hosting duties. This happened to me back in the mid-1980s. I just finished up at school and was headed in to work. We expected a pickup and delivery business that day because there was supposed to be a snowstorm that evening. My parents, as I'm sure you can imagine, were not the sort who would cancel delivery just because of the weather. The flurries had begun to fall before I'd even left school, and by the time I was at work, it was falling quite heavily. It seemed at first that my parents were wrong about the extra business tonight. For the first couple of hours, we didn't even get a single customer. It was after 5 p.m., and the snow was piling up significantly. Then I heard a customer come into the store. My younger brother was supposed to greet him, but I decided to do it since we were so slow. The man who walked in immediately made me uncomfortable. I didn't really know why. He didn't look threatening, but he was acting very weird. He was squinting hard, and we had a big aquarium, which he walked over to and began to speak to the fish. Then he walked up to the counter. After looking at the menu for a moment, he actually said this to me. "Hey, yeah, so what do you recommend, Fu Manchu?" I groaned, but tried not to show my annoyance. This sort of behavior wasn't totally unheard of, and my parents usually tolerated idiots in order to make more money. I suggested he order the beef and broccoli, and when I did, rather than order, he looked at the menu for quite a while. When I was about to say something, he looked away from the menu and looked down at me. He met my gaze head on, and the wild look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. Can I help you with something, sir?" I finally asked, a little bit of annoyance in my voice. He didn't answer me, and even though I hadn't meant to, I began to drum my fingers on the counter in impatience. After a long pause, he asked me, "Do you know karate?" In fact, I did not. This was not an uncommon stereotype back then, but I didn't answer. The man began making fake karate noises at me. I just stared at him in disbelief. "So, you know karate? Tough guy? You want to settle this outside?" "Settle what?" I said to him. "I haven't even done anything to you." The man was getting quite boisterous with his karate noises. His loud voice attracted the attention of my mother. She came out and saw the man giving me a hard time. When she assessed the situation, she demanded that he leave. The guy stopped and pulled a pocket knife out of his coat and began to wave it at my mother and I. He told my mother to make him leave. When he started to make a ruckus again, my dad and 2 of the men from the kitchen came out, each with their own much bigger knives. The chef demanded the man leave, and he did after giving me a long, dirty look. As the evening deepened, the snowstorm began to bring in the regular influx of customers. I had to let my brother and sister take orders because I was getting tons of delivery requests. It was quite rough. The snow was falling very heavily, and I had to drive real slowly. I had to pile several orders into the car at a time and drive to each building at a snail's crawl. I had 3 orders to get out around 10 p.m. Fortunately, 2 of them were in the same apartment building, so after delivering the first, the second and third should be easy. I got out of my car, the snow hitting me in the eyes, and I went up to the buzzer. I was immediately buzzed into the gate and walked up to the building. The first hallway was long and empty. I knocked on the door at its end, delivered the order, and then got into the elevator to go to the top floor. Arriving at the next apartment, I knocked on the door. It won't come as a surprise to anybody hearing this that the man who answered was that racist man from the restaurant earlier. As he opened the door, I felt like a ball of lead had formed in my stomach. I tried to keep my composure and hand the man his food. The creep wouldn't give me money though, and he didn't try to take his food either. He just smiled at me. After a long pause, he asked me once again, "Do you know karate?" My heart was beating fast. I wanted to turn around and run off. I didn't answer and tried to hand the food over to the man. He wouldn't take it though. Finally, I shook my head no. I guess in retrospect, I should have said yes. He was obviously asking me because he wanted to know how easily he could beat my ass. Although I was expecting a beating almost right away, he held his hand out for his food. I handed it to him. He held it for a moment, before throwing it on the floor and stomping all over it. I made to run off, but the man grabbed me and shoved me backwards, my back hitting the wall across the hallway. I hit my head too, and felt fuzzy for a moment. The man walked out into the hallway with me. I wanted to get up and leave, but the wind had been knocked out of me. I didn't know what to do. This guy looked like he was gonna kill me. Not much time had passed between the time I'd fallen against the wall before the man was standing over me. He was about to kick me in the face when someone in the apartment behind the wall opened their door. A man in his early 20s looked out and noticed me laying there. The other man immediately fled back into his apartment and slammed and locked the door. The new guy helped me up and offered to call the hospital for me because it seemed I'd damaged my head. I declined, but I did ask him to walk me out of the building. I didn't tell my parents what happened. They were pretty overprotective, so I knew if I did, they wouldn't let me deliver anymore, and I really liked that job. Fortunately, I never had to interact with that man ever again. Let me start by adding a little info for context. I'm 29 years old, but often get mistaken for being much younger than I am. I look so young, sometimes people mistake me for being 13 to 15 years old. I have a real baby face, and I'm petite as well. I try to use this to my advantage if I don't want to talk to someone. So yesterday, on Saturday, I went to the mall to pick up a new dress since my cousin is getting married next month. I wasn't picking up anything too fancy, since the wedding wasn't super big or traditional. Still though, I thought I should try to look nice. As I picked my last of 5 options and made my way to the dressing room, I was approached by a woman who asked how old I was. I told her not to worry about it, and went to try my things on. I picked out what I liked and exited the dressing room. When I returned the unwanted dresses to an employee, I was again approached by the same woman, who decided it was her business to ask how old I was. Again, I told her to leave me alone, and tried to find some good shoes to match my dress. In the shoe section, I was approached yet again by this woman, who all of a sudden decided I was a child. She started yelling at me about how 12-year-olds shouldn't be left in the mall alone, and asking me where my mother was. I kindly let her know I was an adult, and that I was fine. This seemingly upset her. I guess she reported me to a security guard as a lost child. When approached by security, I answered all his questions and even showed my ID to prove I was an adult. I let him know she'd been bothering me. As far as I know, he told her how old I was and to leave me alone. The rest of the day, though, wherever I went in the mall, this woman followed me the entire way. Finally, I got annoyed enough to just leave, where this woman followed me out to my car and proceeded to try and shove me into her car, telling me she would drive me home. I let her know once again that I was an adult. I had my own car and was going to drive myself home. I got into my car and drove around for a good hour to make sure she still didn't follow me, before finally going home.